Well, welcome to day two of the rezoning hearing, and we've got in the big welcome to everyone that's here, and thank Kit and David for my report yesterday. I had a personal issue to deal with, so that's all good. So I think, given that we've got quite a few in the room today, we will take appearances. I think you all know the panel, but that's just for the record. With you, Christine.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Christine, and I'm part of the administrating team for the hearing.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren O'Byrne, and I'm a policy advisor in the district plan team, and I've been working on the commercial and mixed use. Louise, my policy advisor at the council and the policy team, and I've been working on the rural zones, the fuzz zones, and a small part of the residential zones.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Todd Whitaker. I'm an independent planning consultant and assisting the council as part of it.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Robinson. I'm a co-author on residential rezoning and also part co-author on the rural zones as well.
Kia ora, I'm Dermot Fringley, and I'm another policy advisor at the Auckland District Council, and I was one of the co-authors for the residential report.
Maybe you can't come to the table in the back row there. You're comfortable enough?
No, it's all right. It's all right.
Oh, good.
Good morning, Nick Ray, providing urban design advice, providing aura.
Maria Bell Medicine Council for Congo.
Morena Prenaliga Manager for the planning of Congo.
Let's go to the back of the room now for appearances.
Oh.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Justine. I'm an intermediate development planner at Kaingawater.
Yes.
So I am the Southbank, I'm a principal development planner at Kaingawater.
Morning, I'm Mark Toad with Campbell Brown Planning. Kia ora koutou, Dave Singh, Team Leader Development Planning at Kaingawater.
Welcome, Dave.
Kia ora, Sarah Edwards, District and Lead from the District Council.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Ellie Gibson, part of the district plan team, and I've prepared the report on the general industrial zoning requests.
Thank you, Ali. And just online, we've got Tim and Hamish.
Yes, morning everyone. Tim from Property Economics, assisting council with some economic evidence.
Tim.
Morning, Commissioners. I'm Schwedney, reporting planner for the Future Urban Zone and Major Facility Zone.
Thank you very much, Hamish. So it's Kaingawater's day today, so without further ado, we'll move to you, Mr. Hanson.
Thank you, Commissioners. So just before I start, I thought it would be helpful to just hand out two sets of hard copies. So if I may, sorry, there's only 3 copies each, but so there's two. One is the so there's 2 sets of 3 maps. One's the submission version, and the other's the evidence version. And it's just on a separate A3, so you can actually read them. And Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ray can talk to them. The evidence version has on the right-hand side proposed new zoning extents here in 22. And then the submission version is entitled Appendix 3. So that's the submission, and then the hearing version has hearing 22 on the right-hand side. And then the changes are, if you look down the bottom of the legend, it's got proposed zones and it's shaded in green hedging boundaries. So they're the proposed 3 zones as part of this hearing. So you can see the most obvious changes extended to the yellow diagonal, which was the median density, and then it's now gone to a sort of a 7 with a green. So it's got this, just to make sure everyone's aware.
Just Al, I'd just like to signal that we probably would want to make extensive use of the screen so that everyone can, particularly when your witnesses are talking about specific areas. There's a lot of specific areas, so we'll, Christine, have you mastered the new technology? Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I can, I'll make sure our witnesses are aware of that and take them to the maps.
Thank you.
So for us to get a sense of the difference, we're comparing the pale yellow stripy areas on the submission plans with the now green bordered areas on the hearing plans.
That's correct. Yeah.
And in terms of the submission plan, you've broken down the city into 7 areas. Are those 7 areas used consistently between both sets in terms of the extent to which they apply? They look like that. They look like they do. Or actually, no, slightly different. That's okay. They're generally the same location. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. So I sent around some very brief legal submissions, and thank you for printing those out. I was in between countries, it's hard to find a printer. The
AirPrint, Mr.
yeah,
Madison.
yeah, should have pressed AirPlay. I've set out there at 1.1 background to Kaingora, which you'll be well familiar with now. In terms of the rezoning requested, I've just handed around those 2 maps, which Kaingora submission did seek a widespread upzoning of the general residential zone to medium residential zone. The relief sought for the hearing, as I've just explained, is significantly more refined, as shown in the planning attached to Mr. Campbell's evidence. The rationale is explained by Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ray, and they also had a very good site visit last week before, to actually go around some of these specific areas in Ireland, and there have been quite a lot of the ground truthing did enable a refinement of some of those areas. At 2.4, and I guess this is sort of more a philosophical submission, is the submission that rather than asking why you should upzone an area, I'd submit the panel should ask what are the reasons not to upzone an area. And I explained that below and say that New Zealand's areas, urban areas, are replete with higher intensity zones that have very little intensity. That could be for a range of reasons, including lack of access to amenities, social infrastructure, lack of transport, or the area being seen for whatever reason to be commercially less attractive for development. Where an area is commercially attractive for intensification, then there is only a short window for that intensification to occur. If a less intensive KRZ development occurs, then the more intensive development is effectively foreclosed on that land for at least the next 40 to 50 years. And I guess that's really the key message that I wanted to make in these submissions is you can't really sit here and say, oh, we don't need medium density for the next until 10 years time, because in the next 10 years, if it's redeveloped with the 2-story building, you're not going to knock it down and put a 4-story building. So rather than just looking out 10 years, that's why our submission, you need to look much further, like 30 to 40 years, and so where's this growth needing to be in that time? Otherwise, you foreclose areas that are otherwise very good for intensification in 15 years, and you've just had a 5-year-old building sitting there, and no one's going to pay to knock it down. And then at 2.7, I guess this is the other main submission point, which is New Zealand's residential housing crisis will not be solved only by rezoning land for more intensive development. The solution requires houses to actually be constructed, and that requires a commercially feasible proposition. So again, there's no point saying we've got 300 hectares of zoned land. If on 150 hectares of it, no one's going to build on it because it's commercially not attractive, because it's south facing, it's windy, for whatever reason the amenities aren't there, bad access to transport. So it's actually, if you want to have houses built, you've got to zone land for intensification in the right places that people want to build. Section 3, I just deal with a couple of legal natural justice jurisdiction issues. The 42A report suggested that there were three main challenges to the rezoning. Firstly, the request lacks an evidential basis. Secondly, the council and community should scrutinise a change of the scale. And thirdly, the request has time and cost implications. In respect to the third point, the 42A report says that such wholesale zoning change will require a comprehensive communication strategy and an additional notification and hearings process. I wish to respond to the second, and that should add third points above from a legal perspective. In short, in my submission, there is no natural justice or jurisdiction consent. No case law has been cited to support the Section 42A report's position. And with respect, addressing natural justice is exactly the purpose of the further submission process. Kaingora's original submission clearly set out the extent of its proposed zoning changes it sought, and if anyone had any concerns about that, then they could have lodged a further submission, and in fact, some parties did so. It is the further submission process and subsequent hearing process that provides the opportunity to the community as well as Tangata Whenua to provide comments. Those parties can present their evidence in opposition. The hearing panel will decide the outcome on its merits. While I quite accept as the panel's role to make a decision about the proposed rezoning merits on the basis of the evidence before it, would not be lawful to reject the rezoning proposal on the basis of natural justice, jurisdiction, or suggested lack of consultation, nor would it be lawful to reject the proposal on the basis that the request has time and cost implications for the PDP process. There is no basis to not re-notify or further consult, and any decision can be made in accordance with the currently anticipated timeframes. And I guess just pausing there, this is not a plan change, it's a plan review. We don't have issues about what's on and not on the plan change. It's a full plan review. Any natural justice issues can be dealt with, as I said, through the further submission process. And I guess the counterfactual is it really the case that depending on the extent of zoning you're seeking, you will or won't have jurisdiction depends on a qualitative decision made by a council officer or a planning panel. That's too much rezoning, so therefore you don't have jurisdiction. So I guess the point is the reason why the RMA has a further submission process is so everyone can look at what you actually sought and then say we agree with it or not, as opposed to having to make a qualitative decision on each time and said, well, you've asked for too much rezoning, we're going to have to re-notify. And then the question is, well, what's too much and who gets to decide that? You just can't, it's not a sensible, feasible process, which is why the further submission process. I do accept that the further submission, the submission and further submission, the submission needs to be clear, and then that gives people scope to lodge their further submissions. So in short, I don't think there is a jurisdiction issue, and because of that, there's no need to re-notify, and therefore no delay. And then we've got the three witnesses who have introduced themselves and happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we can get into their evidence.
Any questions for Bill?
Two. One on your last point about jurisdiction, and certainly that was something we were alive to, given that it was signalled in the 42A report. And I guess the question I want to put to you is the council's summary of submissions was a very fulsome summary. It was to some extent almost verbatim across a lot of the content. The one thing it did not do, though, with respect to the Kaingoora submission was actually attach these maps. So there was a reference to the maps, and the summary said there has been a request for zoning changes. These are shown on the maps attached to the submission. Do you think that the failure to present that graphic information in the summary of submissions creates an issue with whether this submission's been appropriately summarised?
I don't, as long as there's a clear reference and it said that there was zoning proposals changed and here's where you go and find them. I mean, that's all you could reasonably do, otherwise you'd be notifying them your summary of submission, the full set of zoning maps that every submitter wanted in the entire submission. And I'm not sure of any summary of submissions notified that I've seen that actually attaches all the maps. A lot of them have cross-referencing, or a lot of them will say, look, there is a wide scale of their zoning proposed, and this is where you can find further information. And I think the point with the summary of submissions is that it's meant to give an ordinary, reasonably well-informed reader an opportunity to understand there might be an issue, and where do you go to try and find more about it. Because you just can't summarise with the best will in the world every aspect of every single submission, let alone, every zone change proposed.
I guess if you took it to its extreme, it wouldn't even be a summary. You'd just be compiling all of the submissions and saying everyone needs to read them to find out what's going on.
And I guess that's sort of the point too, from a natural justice perspective. It might be the individual person whose site is affected or not, in which case you can't even say it's generally in these areas. You're still going to need to go to the maps and actually have a look to see if that particular site was affected or not. So short of almost listing every address, I mean, you have issues about legal title versus addresses, which I don't think that's appropriate for a summary.
There weren't a lot of further submissions on that aspect of the Kailua submission, were there?
Everyone was very, very happy.
Well, that's.
Apart from Wakatahi.
They're not happy with anything, so I think the interesting point is you can speculate either way. I mean, council's speculation to some extent is that the absence of further submissions indicates that no one knew what was happening. Whereas your proposition is the reverse and saying, well, the absence of further submissions suggests everyone knows and we're perfectly happy with it. So and I think both are equally speculative conclusions. I think we've got to be safe in the view, though, that the summary of submissions was accurate, and it enabled, as you say, a reasonably well-informed reader to look at it and say, oh, okay, these guys want to change the zoning of a whole lot of areas. I wonder if that affects my property, and then be able to find the answer.
Yeah, and I guess the other point on that, and this sort of comes to the wider point is, and the point I made at the residential hearing, if you actually look at the difference between the level of development enabled with the GRZ with the residential changes which Kailua is proposing with the medium density residential zone, it's not like it's going from 2-story to 5-story or 2 buildings to 6 buildings. Like it's actually quite marginal. So it looks big on the map, but actually, if you look at actually how that would play out, particularly given that it's only going to be happen in time across the whole area, it's not as if it's all going to pop up overnight. Suddenly, it's all medium density residential. Everyone has a paranoia about if you rezone it, suddenly you're going to wake up the next morning and there's going to be hundreds of acres of apartments. Like that doesn't happen. So, and Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ray can talk about that. But I think that definitely goes to, the nature of change expected and anticipated, and to some extent also to any concerns that Wakatahi might have about traffic generation, etc. It's like, well, it's going to happen over time in different places. It's not all consolidated.
So the next question I want to talk about is about the statutory requirements, and it's probably something I'll get Mr. Campbell's view on in due course. Section 32, when it comes to zoning, is a sort of tricky one. When you look at the section 32 for the residential zones that the council prepared, it was very much focused on looking at the provisions that were both the policies and the development standards plus the zones that were being proposed. So it was sort of very much almost a very broad analysis. We've now got Mr. Campbell's section 32 AA analysis of the specific zoning changes, where he too takes, again, quite a broad analysis. He approaches it and says, horrible talking about you in the third person when you see there, Mike, but I have to do it. It talks about the recommended amendments, okay? Now, section 30, I mean, if we go with the Kangora proposal, we're going to have to make sure we've got a fairly thorough section 32AA analysis of this. So I guess my question from a statutory interpretation perspective, when it comes to zoning, you'll agree, is a method which is part of a rule, in that the zone effectively works in conjunction with the particular rules to identify the spatial location where certain things can or can't happen, or how they can happen in that location. So if the requirement under the Act is that we consider whether the provisions are the most appropriate way to achieve the objectives, do we have to, can you give us any guidance on whether we're entitled to treat that phrase provisions at a very broad level, or whether we are required to look at each of the instances where a change of the rule framework is proposed and run each of those through a section 32 lens?
Yeah, let me have a think about that, because I'd like to have a think about it. I think that the reality is, again, I think it depends on the context, and the context here is a citywide change. And you know, I think you'd have to. My feeling is that, certainly from my understanding, it's been proposed. You know, if you're doing a plan change that changes one zone, 2 objectives, and 3 rules, you'd say you'd have, you know, potentially a more focused analysis on that. If you've got a plan change that involves, you know, zoning plus a whole lot of standards, plus objectives, plus policies, you know, you've got to look at what your what your objectives are, then what your policies are, then say, well, if we want to achieve those objectives with those policies, what does that mean for our rules? And then, you know, you sort of work back from the top, as you did with your, you know, with your initial guidance on that. So, well, if that's where we want to get there, how do all of the provisions work together to achieve that? And I just, you've got to be able to look at them in the round. I think. Otherwise, your analysis will be, and there'll be some aspects of it. I think that's the other point. There'll be some aspects that will pull against each other if you're not looking at a site-specific zoning, and it's much more a broader scale. You know, there'll be some areas where you'd sit there and say, well, if it was a site-specific one, you'd sit there and say, well, that needs a bit more attention to that or that. And also, if it was going from, you know, general residential to business, it might be a different analysis than here. The bulk of the change is going from general residential to medium density residential. And actually, what's the actual effect of that on the ground that you need to be concerned about, either in terms of intensity of development, traffic, or anything else?
So to that extent, I think that's helpful, because you're sort of saying that, of course, there's a provision in section 32(1)(c) which says that your evaluation needs to contain a level of detail that corresponds to the scale and significance. That's the sort of the context proposition. So you're saying it's effectively provisions as generic. It could be a specific provision, or it could be the whole lot, but it's really horses for courses. We need to be satisfied that a greater degree of analysis on a specific location is warranted because of the potential scale and significance of that, i.e. if the degree of change, for example, is quite significant, we might need to focus on it and do a specific analysis. But where the degree of change is not that significant across the board, we could potentially look at it in the round and use the full extent of that phrase, the provisions generally, much like Mr. Campbell's done in his section 32AA, and looked at the amendments across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summary. And also looking at, given the objectives you're trying to achieve, it's not a, you know, a very specific objective like, you know, provide more retail in this location. This is about the broader residential intensification objective. So if that's your starting point, the provisions to achieve that have to be equally broad, you know, assessed on an equally broad basis.
The other aspect of the statutory requirement is that for rules, we have to take into account, or have regard, I forget the phrase, to the actual and potential effects on the environment of it as a consequence of the rules. So do we then treat for example, Mr. Ray's analysis and Mr. Bain's analysis about the respective locational attributes and I guess benefits and costs of each particular proposed change of zoning as a de facto analysis of the effects of each of those changes. Because we're in an interesting scenario where you could just treat the Section 32 evaluation of costs versus benefits and risks of acting and not acting as provoking the question, what is the impact of enabling more growth than what the council considers as appropriate? What are the effects on the environment, actual and potential, of accepting KO's, Kaingora's, proposition for increased zoning?
Yeah, and I think the difference from reading the 42A report, I think the main thing the council, with respect, hasn't considered is that foreclosing of opportunities that is going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, quite accept the need for intensification, around towns and around centres, and you'll see that it's been pulled back really to consolidate around those centres. But I think the one effect or risk, adverse effect or risk or potential future risk that hasn't been properly weighted is that we don't rezone at medium density now and someone redevelops the site, have we foreclosed an opportunity to put one extra dwelling on that and across 100 hectares that actually is a lot more houses.
To me, that really speaks to the Section 32 evaluation rather than the specific effects of a change of zoning at a particular location. And I guess that's where, to some extent, we might need a little bit more help, because it comes down to what's the development potential difference between the two options that we have to some extent, isn't it?
Yeah, and Mr. Liggett's done some work on that, because we anticipated that would be a question. So he can provide some specific detail. And again, I suppose I'd sit there and sort of say, well, that's one way you could look at it. The other way to look at it, say, well, what's the risk of going with the slightly more enabling, Kaingora's position? So what's the downside to that? And then you sit there and say, well, this is the likely built outcome, and within this box, and this is the number of dwellings, and this is the intensity, and you could work through that, particularly again with the refined submission now sort. So what's actually the risk of that, based on the rule framework, the hearings we've been through? What's the adverse effects of that scale of rezone?
I guess just sort of sticking our experienced hats on, what are the likely impacts of increased residential density in specific locations? One, you've obviously got an infrastructure impact, that you're going to need more pipes, potentially greater capacity in pipes, pump stations, those sorts of things. You've got potentially greater traffic, and that's sort of follows. And then I guess the rest of them, to some extent, all come down to quite that sort of very nebulous concept of amenity, don't they? Is it an impact when a neighbourhood that might all be 1930s bungalows suddenly starts every black key on the piano keyboard becoming some nice modern terraced houses or something? Does that have an amenity impact, particularly when we've signalled an interim recommendation that sort of change is actually anticipated? So I guess, do you see there are any other effects that we need to be sort of thinking about across the board?
No, and I think it's no, again, no, in short. We went through this exact issue in rezoning out there, and there were some specific sites, like we had a couple that were no exit sites onto a motorway, onto a state highway that was quite busy, and those areas we agreed, okay, well, that's probably fair enough. So there were some sort of small site specific ones, which this was at the environment court stage, and we sort of had, so there's some of those. But again, from an infrastructure perspective, and I appreciate we haven't brought infrastructure evidence, but equally with the now refined position we've put in forward, and the fact it's not all going to happen at once, and the fact that, as Mr. Campbell will explain, you get above a certain amount, you're into RDA criteria anyway, which will include infrastructure assessments. And then you're literally down to a character analysis, and you know, one might say that concerns why New Zealand's in the trouble it is. But anyway,
You like old things, is
yeah.
that what you're saying?
No, but I do think that you'll see, and we'll get Mr. Rowe, Mr. Campbell to take it through this, but the areas that are proposed to be, you know, medium density are now a lot more confined around those centres. And I think we'll reinforce those centres. You know, I mean, I think Mr. Liggett can explain, I mean, from Kaingaroa's perspective, they would have preferred a larger degree of rezoning, I suspect, and he can address you on that. But you know, this is a solid proposal that will significantly preserve that future development opportunity.
Thanks for that. Last question then. Kaingaroa's proposal with respect to the residential zones is for a notification exclusion rule, which would preclude public notification, limited notification, and the requirement for neighbours' approvals. So would you accept that to some extent, if we are to adopt that proposal, we need to be satisfied that the change in amenity that might be enabled by greater density, that the effects of that are acceptable across the board? Because effectively, if we adopt the non-notification exclusion proposition, we're essentially saying that neighbours within these blocks where greater development is enabled will not have a say on it.
Well,
We're effectively having that say for them now by having to reach a view that the effects on their localised amenity are acceptable.
well, except that my understanding of the notification exclusion is that you've got to comply with all your height relations.
Yeah,
So when you say amenity, that actually, I think what you're talking about is neighbourhood character. And yes, I think in that circumstance, that's exactly why we're seeking that exclusion. So you don't have to debate neighbourhood character every time.
Okay.
But accepting that adjacent neighbouring amenity, sunlight access, all that sort of stuff is absolutely fair enough.
So just working through the reasoning then, if we're satisfied that the proposed bulk and location standards on a site-by-site basis adequately preserve amenity, those basic sunlight access, no domination, all of those sorts of things, then we can reason from that will apply across the board wherever it happens, and provided that those bulk and location standards are achieved, then we no longer have to concern ourselves that there is going to be some other form of amenity impact.
Yeah, well, and remembering that Mr. Campbell suggested some, like I think it was the outlook standard that was more onerous, more generous. And yeah, absolutely agree. And you know, and that then takes you right back up to the top of an enabling residential density with a planned future character in the right place. And that's, you know, I think by the time you get rid of all of those other aspects of amenity, you're literally with character.
With change in character and people's perception that change in an environment means something bad is happening. And it's, I mean, that's just a human reaction. I mean, we're fight or flight sort of creatures, really. So yeah, it is a real change in focus, as you pointed out, because for the longest time we've sort of done urban planning by looking at what's there and saying, well, what's the most we can deviate from that before everyone starts to get nervous? Whereas the MPSUD is saying, well, hold on, you're going to have to look a little bit further afield and people are going to get nervous, potentially. I mean, is that how you see it?
Well, I might get nervous. Equally, some people might sit there and say this is a good thing. We don't want to leak the old building that's been here since the 1930s. We'd rather something new and warm and dry and, you know, put another 300 people in arms.
Thank you. Just to follow up there for David, his questions. And we're not dealing with any neighbourhood character overlays here with this plan, are we? Like there are some plans, we don't have a character overlay. So that's another planning tool which might have been used, not dealing with that. So that's not playing. Okay, David?
Yeah, thank you, thanks, Stephen. Nathan, I've got 5 questions. 2 or 3 of them overlap with worked on. Before I go through those, I just wondered, did you and your team observe any of the settings from yesterday?
I certainly wasn't in the year. You were not.
No,
Sorry.
it's unfortunate.
It was scintillating stuff.
There was a lot of discussion about paragraph 77 and the 3 reasons for the council position. You'll comment on some of those today. I might come back to that. The second thing, just before I go on to my questions, is I just want to record that I haven't been involved in the hearings on the residential zone or the residential design guide, but I was involved in the central city and mixed use zones, and I'm aware of the KO position with respect to those zones. So just some context there. On the points 1 and 2 and 3 in your legal position on those about jurisdiction and process in terms of what Mr. Robinson's raised. And I've listened carefully to your answers to Mr. Willdon about summary of submissions, etc. Do you think the council could have gone further or even should have gone further and perhaps served notice on property owners who were potentially affected by the upzoning? And if we answer the give some context, we've had submissions from Taranaki Heritage who've asked for a number of additional archaeological and heritage sites to be included in the schedules. And the response from the officers there is along similar lines to points 2 and 3, that creates procedural unfairness and needs to go through a schedule 1 process to do that. And so the recommendation in respect to those heritage listings sought from Taranaki Heritage is to decline those additional ones and rely on a future process. So at least there's some consistency in the response from the council position on that. But the question I have for you is, could the council have gone further and served notice on those parties affected, and should they have done that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? If Congroy's submission had been what we're now proposing, would there still be that issue? Because one site is affected. So you'd sit there and say, if we'd zoned 3 blocks, does that mean you need to serve notice on every one of those 3 blocks? I mean, the only thing different here is scale. The individual landowner is affected, and so in my submission legally, the council doesn't have to individually notify everybody, provided that the summary of submission was clear that there was rezoning proposed, and that if you want further detail, you can go here or click on this and look at it.
For the record, I would have asked you the same question in respect to the reposition KO position also. Because I accept it's a question of scale, but I guess the principles are still behind my question. Okay. The second question, and this is slightly out of order, there was a lot of discussion yesterday about the role of the future urban zone, and particularly the smart road. And you've seen Mr. Heath's evidence, and I've read Mr. Campbell's evidence, and there's been some suggestion that the smart road future urban zone is required. My question to you is, does the Coanga or original submission provide scope for the deletion of that future urban zone over smart road?
Yeah, I had a look at that again this morning, and I think we would need to come back on that. I don't think it's as clear, certainly not clear on the maps from what I can see. And that you know, if you're a landowner, so I agree with that. So we'll need to come back to you on that.
It's an important consideration.
No, I understand.
Mr. Heath and Mr. Robinson have relied on its inclusion in terms of the total quantum. And obviously Mr. Campbell has also assumed that it may not be required, at least in the short to medium term anyway.
And I think just being consistent too, I mean, in terms of if a it is future urban zone and it's sensible to keep it as future urban zone and not use it for something else, if it's going to be needed in 20 or 30 years, then likewise, not labelling as that might be quite sensible, provide the objectives and policies are quite clear, and that doesn't become future urban zone, it gets a plan change next week, which is happening.
Just pausing there, Bill, it's the second thing you said you'd come back to us on.
Yeah.
Didn't even make a note of the first one.
That was the section 32 provision. We might have discussed it.
No, I think I'm.
So you don't
Okay,
even
no,
know that.
we're right.
So you'll come back to us with at the end of your legal submissions. is that
Yeah,
right?
it'd just be the jurisdiction for the future urban zone.
Okay, thank you.
In that area, which I accept.
Okay, that was going to be my fourth question. I'll jump to that now. Because I, and it's no criticism of Mr. Campbell, but I was expecting more than this for the 32AA. It's like a summary of effectiveness, efficiency, cost benefits, and risk of acting and not acting. And maybe that's sufficient if it was to cross-reference the evidence and to reference the policies and objectives that it's giving effect to, but I'm not seeing any of that in this page and a half at all. I know there's been a lot of criticism, section 32A across the country, and I think we'll see quite a change to the approach under the NBA and respect to that. It'll be more of a comparative analysis, it'll be upfront, it'll be done before rather than an afterthought. So I would expect if we were going to adopt the KO position, the revised position, we would need to see a little bit work on this, if only some cross-referencing back to evidence and policies and objectives in terms of that appropriateness.
Yep, thank you. I'm very happy to provide that.
Third point, Joan, third question is putting aside the legal and jurisdictional aspects that Mr. Robertson raised, those 2 points that we just talked about. Really, it's the evidential basis that this will come down to, and I think Mr. Robinson accepted that yesterday. And the position I got from Robinson and his colleagues was that they think they have enough land, enough capacity, without spatially extending the residential zone. And I guess, so that you know, and that's why I asked, did you observe yesterday? We've asked Mr. Robertson and the team to update the numbers to reflect revised KO position, to reflect Mr. Heath's position. Mr. Heath's found another 1,500 apartments in the central city zone. I think that's the case. And to reflect some of the other zoning changes that have been recommended, albeit not decided yet. So changes to mixed use zones, there's the living overlay extension in central city over the mixed use zone on a particular site. So we've asked for that table to be put in front of us so we can see what the quantum is in terms of capacity. What Mr. Robinson was unsure of, and I think Mr. Heath was unsure of, is what the additional amount of housing capacity that will be provided by the revised KO position. Mr. Heath had worked on the basis that the original submission had increased the land holding from 265 hectares to just over 1,000 hectares. He said that equates to something like 8,000 houses. So do you know, or do any of your witnesses know what the difference between these 2 plans equates to in terms of land area and housing supply?
Yeah, we've asked, I think the answer is it's become more complicated, I think, by the changes proposed to the residential zones as well, of which I know you're involved in. So I think assuming that the Kaingora residential zone provision as proposed or adopted, that will give one answer. If you take the residential zone rules as notified, that will give you another answer. So, but I've asked Mr. Ray and Mr. Campbell to have a think about that because I anticipated that would be a question.
Because there might be, from a drafting assistance point of view, some benefit in Mr. Ray and Mr. Campbell assisting Mr. Robinson in that task to produce an agreed statement of facts, if you like, in terms of what's the resource we're clear everything's going to turn on capacity. And just on that issue of capacity, do you have anything to say to us in terms of the direction in the NPSUD on capacity?
Well, no, not other than we've addressed in, I suppose, in the earlier, higher level hearings. I suppose, what I would say on that capacity issue again, it's very hard to know what we don't know beyond 15, 20 years. You think about what we thought 15, 20 years ago. And I would come back to that foreclosing point. And, if in 20 or 30, 35, 40 years, we think it's a good idea to have medium density around residential, around centres, why wouldn't we zone that now? Rather than take the risks that somebody might or might not do, a more intensive development next to a centre and incentivise the centre and activate it. If that's your long-term objective, leaving aside economic modelling and forecasting and everything else, the long-term objective is to have intensive residential activity around centres. In 40 years' time, why don't you zone it?
In terms of the Section 32 analysis, generally in terms of appropriateness, in terms of the objectives giving effect to the Act and the Haurua documents, and then the provisions, the policies, rules and methods giving effect to those objectives. As our starting point, the strategic objective on the UFD 14, because that seems reasonably settled in terms of parties' position on that, both at the council and the submitter level.
Yeah, and I think, your decision ultimately on your zoning and your other methods needs to be driven from those key objectives. And that for the zoning, given what we're talking about, which is, again, general to medium residential, which is all about residential intensification. That would certainly seem to be the most.
Okay, well, I'll have some questions for Mr. Campbell on that, but I guess Mr. Campbell goes to that comments about the 32AA and going back to are the provisions, is the spatial increase in medium density appropriate, give effect to that strategic objection, particularly given that it's in two tranches, a short to medium term, which is up to 10 years, which focuses on infill intensification and I think greenfield structure plans, and then the long term 10 to 30, which is mainly the domain of the future urban zone. So some reference back to the appropriateness of the provisions and achieving that objective, I think is essential in the 32AA. Just on that notification exclusion rule, I know we're getting a little bit out of topic here, but did KO suggest a similar rule in the central city? Might want to come back.
We'll
to
come
us
back
on
to
that.
that.
Reasonably thorough. Precursor requests to come for the two witnesses, or three witnesses, so.
But rough, you do 3 pages of legal submissions, you get an hour of cross-examination.
Yeah.
Like you
Should have gone last.
Clarification.
Yeah, right.
I just want to pick up one procedural point about the suggestion of agreed statement of facts on the moments. Seems like that would be a useful process. And I'm just wondering, Campbell, whether you need Mr. Heath or someone else or to assist with that?
Yes,
Yes.
definitely Mr. Heath, Ms. White,
Yes.
a lot of background in that area as well,
Yes.
And we'll need
and others as well.
a couple of in-house staff
Okay.
who prepared the HBA would need to be involved as well.
Yes. And are you clear enough on, I wasn't here yesterday, but I think, are you clear enough on sort of the task? Campbell, I'd ask you to probably lead this task.
Based on the discussion yesterday.
Yes. Yes, and I'm interested in the, for the medium density residential, the difference between the council position on house numbers and Kaingora's position. That will just give us set there.
I think it's important that you just make any assumptions so quite clear.
Yes.
I mean, obviously there's a difference between feasible, theoretical, feasible, and likely to be achieved feasible. Whether you try and encompass all of those parameters, I don't know, but if you do, just make that clear.
Campbell would get that with the right reply. That would be the plan. Yeah. So if you could just leave that in your hands to coordinate, that would be great. Thank you. Look, I think we should take just a brief break now. I have to signal I've got another meeting 12:15, so we'll have to make a hard break then as well. So we have 10 minutes now for break and come back at 25:02. And we can hear from the witnesses. Thank you. Before we get going, I've had a message that those on Zoom are struggling a little bit to hear us. So the request is to speak clearly and yeah, perhaps I don't know where all the microphones are. I think they're everywhere around here, but just if you can remember to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Liggett, you should have his evidence, so I'll ask him to speak to it and or answer questions.
Mr. Lee, before you get underway, great to see quite a bunch of your team here today. We really appreciate there's quite a team of people from Kaingaroa working pretty hard on these matters. Just out of my own interest, are you all from, how's Kaingaroa organised with the regional head offices? And I've never sort of put my mind to it, but are you all from one office or?
So, yeah, it's split different ways for different functions.
Yes.
So in terms of the planning function,
Yes.
we're run as a national team.
Yes.
My team, I've got it set up into 3 core location teams.
Yes.
Auckland, Northland, Bombay to Wellington, which is part of the teams here
Yes.
today, and then South Island.
Okay.
And then in terms of office locations, some of the team from Wellington, Auckland, and South Island.
Okay. Great. Yes. Thank you for that. Right. Can I have the evidence? Thank you.
Okay, so just briefly, and try to do it, Bill Matheson, and keep 3 pages. Hopefully it's only 3 minutes, not an hour, but
Inversely proportional.
yeah.
The less you write, the more you get questions.
Well, the point was right there, this question. Anyway, so there is a lot that is put into the hearing 1 evidence about background, and I guess it kind of culminates for us in the hearing last week and the hearing today. And it's not just about colours on a map for us; it's actually about the package. And in particular, in my evidence for today at 3.6, I've highlighted there that taking the primary submission and the evidence that's been presented both across previous hearing topics and the mapping that's the team are putting forward today, is that if all of that is adopted, then the constraints applied by the zoning and the provisions of the plan as was notified would be reduced. Now, language is everything and words are specific. I've used the word reduced, I haven't used the word removed. And since preparing this evidence and getting more of the team's evidence and the mapping pulled through, we've done some work on our own portfolio, which is the information we have available to us. We don't have the citywide data sets the council has, to understand what that means in terms of the supply of social housing today and going forward. And you would have heard from Val a lot about the foregone conclusion. If you put an outcome down and something happens on that land, it's gone for 30 to 40 years. I could even stretch that further to say it may be gone for good. And if you look at the development program that we're running across the country, the biggest constraint that we have once you deal with planning rules and the feasibility or the commercial realities of development is actually the fragmentation of the land that you start with in the first place. So if we make decisions to provide a level of development and that development occurs and the land is fragmented further than what it is today, in 2 to 3 decades' time, if you come back, you've then got an added complexity on top of what you're facing today. So in terms of the view that we have advanced in the submission, having the team work through evidence, it is actually taking a longer range view. And now, from Kaingora's perspective, a 10-year horizon is not a planning horizon, it's an implementation horizon and giving you immediacy to that. If you're talking about what you need as a framework, you should be looking 30 to 40 years out. And then you drive through sequence delivery steps, a range of interventions in the marketplace that are controlled by various parties. Council being one, where is it putting its infrastructure? Where is it enhancing network performance to facilitate infrastructure readiness and development? And then equally the market, and I put Kaingoora in that camp as a developing partner, then responding to that in terms of the commercial reality. Now for us, commercial realities are such different. We're not operating in the way that a developer does across the market. We have a very different set of funding streams and a different set of financial drivers. So some of the things that we would say are feasible for us to do are not feasible for the market to do because of the way we operate and the way we fund and the outcomes that we're talking about.
Brendan, I'd like to just talk a little bit about these timescales. You'll see that in our interim directions, we've differentiated between short to medium, and that's focusing on infill and zone land, including structure plan land, and in the longer term, the future urban zones. So you mentioned the 10-year planning horizon. I presume you're referring to the nominal lifetime of district plan. And I think most of us have experienced enough to know that it often stretches out to 15 or 20 years, just in terms of a time frame. So that's one element. We've got our 30-year LTP infrastructure council planning horizon. And then in my mind, we've also got this nominal 50-year life of a building in the Building Act, which I don't know how relevant that is in reality either, because many of our buildings last, most of them way longer than that. So my question really is around, in your mind, that term short to medium term in the strategic objectives policy. What does that mean in your mind versus longer term?
I think if you're talking, the way we are viewing short to medium is what can you reasonably, with a bit of certainty, forecast as a delivery outcome. So that, in terms of all of the planning cycles across all of the various different pieces of legislation, like the Government Act, Transport Management Fund, all of that, you start to get certainty at 10 years as to what will happen on the ground. So that's a delivery timescale. So whether you call it short, whether you call it short to medium, I think that's probably appropriate. In terms of the longer term, do you go 30, do you go 50, do you go 80? You are starting to crystal ball gaze in any event. And some of the funding decisions are a lot more, agile is not the right word, but flexible at that point, because you're going through 2 or 3 or 4 sets of decision points around will that funding be realised or not for that particular project that unlocks all of these outcomes. So there's degree of flexibility, the more decades you go out in terms of what's funded and what's not. But I think your short to medium being a 10-year horizon is probably appropriate construct.
So you would relate short to medium being a 10-year delivery contract.
So just with all of that in mind, and not to conflict myself, what do we know for certain in terms of the social housing space and what we're tasked to do. We have a 4-year funded plan that comes through from Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. So for Taranaki, and this shoots back to paragraph 4.4 of my evidence in June last year, is there's 80 to 120 houses to be delivered over 4 years. So 20 to 30 per annum. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but in real terms, the way we are doing that at the moment, given what is feasible for us to deliver is through retail. Because we have two issues we're trying to address. One is the condition and maintenance obligation that sits on the portfolio as it is today, as well as the enhancement of that existing stock into better condition asset.
So they got on those figures.
So it's 80 to 120 across Taranaki with the lion's share. I wouldn't say 100%, but you're talking high 90s sitting within the district itself. So it's 20 to 30, 20 to 30. So if we were to take that longer term horizon, not that this is again certainty not accounted for and funding not confirmed, but if you were to say 20 to 30 per annum is the trajectory, you're talking 600 to 900 houses over 2 years. In terms of a public housing response. So what does that mean for us in terms of all of the scenarios? So this is what we're talking about here is the district plan provisions and what that means for an organisation like us against the land. There's currently 970-ish, it changes a little bit more frequently now than it has done in the past. In New Plymouth, about 970 dwellings sitting on 60 hectares of land across 800, circa 800 individual parcels of land. So if we take what is the operative plan before we start the process, our assessment of that is that we have a plan-enabled outcome of 210 additional dwellings. So about a third of the longer-term need at 20. I'm going to chuck a lot of numbers at you. If you want me to slow down or move in a different direction, happy to.
I'm just wondering if you've just compiled these numbers. Yes. Yes. So go through them, but perhaps give us the numbers written up.
We can write them up. Yeah, I was going to say, we're happy to write them up.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the 800 again?
So there's 800 existing parcels approximately.
Yes.
Make up that 60. So under the operative plan, we get plan enabled. What does the plan allow you to do? Subject to infrastructure and feasibility and commercial elements. We get 210. If we loosely look at what we asked for in the submission, so just give you a comparison between submission and where we landed today. The submission across that 60 hectares would have, as a plan-enabled outcome, given us about 1,400 additional dwellings. In broad terms, that, and I'll use the word, would likely be sufficient to meet the needs of that 600 to 900. When we come through the process, the team has been through to land on the suite of provisions that we put forward in the hearing the other day, as well as the maps that are before you today and that the team will talk through. There's two elements I would flag to you is what is actually permitted. So 2 or 3 dwellings on a site, depending on the general residential or the medium density residential as it's applied. Plan enabled perspective would see about 114 dwellings enabled under that suite of law packages. In terms of a feasible outcome, probably drop somewhere between 370 and
370 and 350.
sorry, 270 and 350. That's the differentiation between what's enabled and then what you can actually do from a commercial outcome.
So you're going to tell us why the difference?
Difference comes to, in terms of one, is a demand element. Do you need as many smaller dwelling types? We actually have to provide the family housing as well. So when you do that, you lose some of that yield. And for some of the reasons that the team have highlighted around the characteristics of some of the sites that we're talking about, there is significant slope. There is cost that gets incurred in delivering that. So a pretty horrendous example of that on a site being subdivided right now. Change zoning, we did promote it as a centre zone. We've now suggested that be medium density residential and cut into that hill. Goodness knows how to pay for it, but there's other outcomes that come if you just deliver everything to plan or otherwise enable. So there's a range of reasons why that drops back. But our assessment under the assumptions that we're working to is in the order of 270 to 350. So in real terms, if we actually move too far from what the plan currently enables, no, we've just distributed it in a different way and on a different height. And we've made it feasible rather than just enabled with that tail that's going to come off. If we look at then the provisions, because it's a package and not everything is permitted and some things are subject to assessment, but if they are, then you have it through that restricted discretionary activity, potential for additional outcome. For us, that shifts it up about 50% in terms of what's enabled by the plan. So we can get about 940 dwellings off the portfolio under the zoning and law package that's being put forward by the team. And if we move that through the feasibility lens, it gets us just on 700 dwellings. So what is that telling us is, and I go back to 3.6 in the evidence, is that the constraints of the plan are being reduced. They're not being completely removed in terms of what would be needed over the longer term, in terms of the management of the public housing portfolio, as well as the wider need for affordable housing, need for market housing generally, which under that scenario, a greater degree of that affordable housing would actually come out of a private market delivery rather than off our own land based on where the competition is today. What that's saying is we're going to need more of our land for public housing. Working that through to go, well, how do we close the gap over the long term? Done some work on what do you need in terms of other land. Again, if you were to apply the residential framework that the team put together to other land, whatever that is, wherever that is, we're estimating we'd need somewhere between 11 and 12 hectares net developable to be available on top of what we currently have. So we're talking somewhere about 20% land deficit in the long term. I guess the real thrust of where all of the material that the team put together, and why those numbers matter and why it's important, is where we started. We started from a principal place of actually trying to remove as many layers or as many constraints out of the plan as possible to enable a particular urban form from the plan. The team have since gone through that and reviewed what council has put forward. In terms of the evidence position and the maps in front of you, we have applied a principled approach. It's not a selfish, what does KO need and what would that do to our portfolio? We actually overlay the portfolio on top of the maps. And the difference between the 900 and 1400 is actually the fact that a lot of our land isn't now proposed for the medium density zone, based on the principles that the team have put forward. And as I was grappling with that last night, going, well, what does that mean and why have we got there? And I think it's about a slightly focused emphasis around that policy 5 of the NPSUD. Part of the submission as we constructed it was looking at relative accessibility and public transport, and a bit of the relative demand being 5B. Reading and observing all the evidence and a lot of the discussion, there has been quite a bit of what is the demand and how we match demand versus what is the alternative proposition, which is, well, if we're going to enable stuff, we want to enable it in locations of high accessibility, the centres focus, which is what the team has put forward. You could then take that further forward, and my read of policy 5A is other transport options. Now, the centres focus that we've put forward is around walking, cycling, and direct connection to centres. The other question is public transport and connectivity between centres and corridors. And there's probably less of that in the proposal that you see now than what the submission had originally crafted. We would look to the public transport routes. Well, they do provide accessibility. And it is it's a comparative assessment between existing urban footprint versus new greenfield areas. And I think if I go back to a comment, Commissioner Littlejohn, you were talking about the effects of this in terms of infrastructure and traffic. It's the comment that we would put to that is those effects occur for every dwelling that's built anywhere. What we're dealing with is the spatial allocation and distribution of those effects across a geography. So we can choose to consolidate it in the urban footprint, or we can choose to put it out in continued greenfield. All of those greenfield environments need pipes just the same as the existing urban environment does. They all need transport connection. The difference is, can you leverage off the existing infrastructure and availability of that, or are you going to continue to supply new and or to service new locations? I guess trying to summarise it all up so I can allow others to speak. Where we've got to for us is it's actually not through deliberate action in the sense of we haven't actually gone, this is a number we must achieve and work to that, work through the principles and where the cards have fallen from that set of principles, where we've landed over the long term. What the numbers say to me is we're going to achieve 70% of what we need in the existing footprint. The rest of it is 30% somewhere else. Now, footprint, I'm talking about our portfolio. 30% of it has to happen elsewhere. Now, that's going to be either brownfield or greenfield. There'll be investment cases to determine that. Yeah, not trying to draw a parallel between a 70-40 or 60-30 or however other numbers get constructed in the Auckland discussion, but that's just how the numbers fall.
It's for the public housing estate. Yes.
Probably said quite a lot, chucked a lot at you. I might just leave it there if there's questions on that.
Yeah, I think just following up on getting this to us in a form, I'm just thinking public housing feasibility table, which you could put numbers together, maybe with some footnotes explaining just what you've told us. Something quite compact would be really helpful. And maybe if you feed that in through the agreed sort of a part of the package we talked about with Campbell, either separately or together, just as long as we can capture your evidence around public housing, that'd be great. Kit, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a couple. You used the phrase when talking with the chair about the phrase I wrote down, 10 years is not a planning horizon. There's an implementation time frame, and I think you then rephrased that later, calling it a delivery timescale. I'm just interested, delivery or implementation of what? Was that a comment reflecting just Kāinga-Ora's aspirations with its estate? Or is there another sort of outcome that you perceive is to be the focus of the 10 years in terms of housing supply generally?
In terms of the comment around the 10 years, for us, that's delivery, building houses. What other parts of the system, it's implementation, because that's funding decisions made by others. Whether it's delivery, that's in terms of what we can achieve. Others will control that as a delivery. So, subtleties of wording, but effectively saying the same thing, what we control versus what we don't control.
So 10 years for you is a delivery timeframe for your aspirations for your estate.
And I would read into the other legislative obligations of other entities like council. They've got to plan and deliver it over a 10-year lifespan. In terms of their budget allocation through the long-term plan for council, that's 10 years of budget to deliver things.
I was going to ask the question, looking at this plan here, are all of the new areas, are all of the public housing estate within those areas? And you've answered that question, you've said they're not, which I guess then focuses me back on the aspect of the case for Kāinga-Ora that I've been, I guess, just trying to get my head around the most, because it was a comment that was made yesterday by council staff to effectively saying, well, look, if Kāinga-Ora were just here looking at increasing the opportunities for them to develop their land, and these maps were only focused on their land, then that might be something that we'd consider. And I think that was a comment made from this natural justice sort of proposition, that if you're only seeking to improve the lot for your own land and you're not impacting on anyone else, then that might be slightly more acceptable than if you were actually looking at zoning further afield. But it does sort of bring us back to the question, why are you here, in a way? And because your evidence is very much focused on providing opportunities for Kāinga-Ora to reconfigure its own land holdings, is one phrase it uses, reduce regulatory constraints to increase supply for its land holdings. And it's not until 3.6 that I think the seed of the answer appears, which is that securing, I'm quoting from the last sentence, securing additional capacity across the board, not just on Crown-owned land, provides an opportunity to work with the private sector to increase the development of affordable housing across the district. And I guess that's, as I say, the seed of the answer, because it seems to be implicit in that for whatever reason, Kāinga-Ora perceives that its overall objective to provide social housing is not only achieved by it actually going out there and building affordable housing under its funding model, but also increasing the range of private sector affordable housing so that the pressure on Kāinga-Ora to have to do so is also reduced. Is that why you're here? You see an opportunity across the board to improve the affordability of housing and take the pressure off the state to have to do so.
Yeah, and I guess it goes to our two core functions, and that's why I've referenced back to the hearing stream one evidence. There's two elements to that in terms of our statutory function. One is the public housing landlord, the class is what's used. And yeah, I guess a lot of what I've been talking about, 970 dwellings and potential for that to realise other additional housing, it's largely focused around that element. The reason it's not largely focused around that is because there isn't a surplus once we get beyond the public housing need to put it into other things, which is a different proposition than when we were dealing with the Auckland and Christchurch discussions a few years ago. Articles in the Herald last weekend park for a minute, about what the commentators are saying about that today. The other element, though, of our statutory function is to initiate and facilitate urban development outcomes to achieve that wider housing market benefit. And I say benefit in terms of the ability to deliver. And that's partly predicated on the fact that if we have a market that can deliver a lot more of various different types of housing to meet those needs, then we will be able to start to make it more affordability issue. If we constrain it so tight, where we've picked a few select winners or directed very, very specific and exclusive outcomes on very few pieces of land, if those outcomes fail to materialize for whatever reason, we have a problem. And part of the spatial application of the medium density residential zone is actually to respond to it, to make sure that there is enough of that resource. And I think Michael has done some work on what that means across the city as a proportion. You know, we're not talking 100% of the existing urban footprint is medium density residential. Other jurisdictions, we are having that conversation. If you were tier 1 under the SUD, that's the conversation we're having. It's a very different proposition.
David? Yeah, thanks, Mr. Liggett. You're right, a lot of numbers. It's codified a lot of uncertainty in my mind, actually. What I'm uncertain of is the 60 hectares. Is that the Crown portfolio, or is that? Okay, so that's the Crown-owned portfolio and
Kaingaroa owned.
Yes.
Not Crown owned.
No, I'm sorry, Crown. Thank you. Okay, so and the change of position, and this is an issue I'd raised earlier with Mr. Campbell and Matheson, is the original submission was anticipating 1,400 additional dwellings, and now we're down to around 900.
In terms of enabled.
Yeah, enabled, yeah, plan enabled.
This is down.
Yes. And is that the answer to my question about what the net difference in supply is in terms of the original submission and the hearing position?
As it relates to our.
As it relates to your portfolio, yes.
It's not an exact extrapolation.
As it relates to those 60 hectares.
You can't exactly extrapolate that to the rest of the housing market because our land ownership is a little bit unique in that it's generally more than one site by itself.
Yes, so it's half the equation, isn't it? It's half the answer.
It's part of the answer, it's not the full answer. There's a lot more work for people to do to.
I think the information that you're going to formalise needs to come in earlier than Mr. Campbell's exercise. It needs to inform this exercise. And I think it would be useful for us to receive that at the same time if possible. So I don't want to rely on that. Okay. What I'm hearing is that Kaingaroa, in terms of the provisions that were discussed at the residential zone, are relatively happy now that they can deliver on their remits and their statutory functions to achieve the numbers that you've got in your different planning horizons. The issue now is the role of the private sector to deliver on housing capacity across the district in terms of that wider function of ensuring that there's supply generally available.
In part, so for the short to medium term, we would have a solution with the rules and the mapping. For the longer term horizon, and there's a whole lot of decisions that need to be taken through that period. Understand that, but if we take the circumstances that we're working in today, we would need to find another 12 hectares of land out of the market directly.
Thank you. I was just going to ask you about the 12 hectares. So we've heard in previous hearings about some of the partnerships that Kaingaroa have developed with other suppliers. I think the council officers alerted us to the Soho development. Is that, going forward, is that a typical model that Kaingaroa are endorsing to provide additional capacity, both in terms of affordable and housing stock?
One of the models, and that in terms of what I've just described, that's us trying to address part of the 12 hectares now. So it's one of the models, it's not the only. It's relying on the market being there.
Yes, yes.
And us partnering with them on their outcome. There are models where we partner with the market. Market development as it exists on the hill today.
Yes.
Example of that where we had to start with a partner with the market to deliver.
Yes. And so that goes to both the spatial extent of the medium density and the rules that apply.
Yeah. Yes. So as in a nutshell, if you tinker with the rules beyond what we've put forward, those numbers change.
Yeah.
If you constrain the rules, those numbers go down. And they go down on our portfolio, and they also go down across the market to another measurable. If you tweak them up, or if you put more spatial extent of the medium density zone, those numbers go on the supply side.
I'll leave it there, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riggett.
Nothing else?
Nothing else? No.
Thank you. Right, Mr. Ray, feel free to use pictures. Use pictures.
Good morning. Look, there's quite a bit of detail in here, so I suppose it's, again, like we talked about last week, interject where you need clarification. And I'll start at the top of page 4, which is that first paragraph is read if I may. So I just wanted to point out there that Mr. Campbell and I came back to New Plymouth on the 23rd of May to ground test all of this and to change some of our recommendations with this. And I thought it was a very important process to do, to see all of this land in one day. And I would strongly urge, I'd love to take you around for a bus tour to show you, because I think it's worth the discussion out on the site, you know. And I know we can't do that here, but it is important to do that, I believe.
Did you manage it all in one day? It's a pretty big area.
A lot of driving. But it was good, just to elaborate on that, it was good to see where sun access comes into valleys, at what time during the day, for example, midday, understanding those more detailed landscape attributes that contribute to amenity, and where people may or may not choose to build housing as well because of those aspects of it. And you know, seeing school kids coming out of schools and where they're going, what they have to cross, and how they get to school, main roads, etc. I'm just thinking about the boys' school, with your school, and the location that they are relative to intensification of housing. So, so that was really important. Turning to paragraph 7 and the assessment methodology at the bottom there, the review of that strategic direction was really important from my perspective, which sets that strategy of intensifying primarily in the city centre and local centres around within the existing urban environment. I understood that strategic direction did not include the future urban area, as it's not a zoned area for residential, it's a future urban area which needs to be zoned for development. So I'm just picking up on the discussion that has been had prior to that. Now, I may have got that interpretation wrong, but when I was thinking about it,
I don't think we do either.
Good. No, that's fine.
But we saw that in the long term.
Longer term.
Yeah, but there are some structure plan areas, I think there's 8 of them, which are definitely in the zone.
In our zone. Yep.
For the short to medium term. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
5 plus 1 proposed addition.
Okay, 5 plus 1.
At 7.1, I list out the documents I've reviewed. I won't canvass those for you to review. But at B at the top of the page, I just referred to in my evidence. I just want to clarify this, that Appendix B is not missing out of my evidence. It is Mr. Campbell's Appendix B, and I'll just make that clear. Under the planning context, I rely on that, the Section 42A reports and the direction provided by the government in terms of those overarching policy statements. And 8.2 is really where this direction, and I set out your interim guidance there at UDF 13, and I highlight by underlining that the short-term mix of infill, undeveloped zone land intensification around the city centres and around local centres and transport nodes. And I would extend that node to perhaps include routes as well, but the nodes perhaps referred to bus stops in this context. And I've suggested elsewhere in my evidence that maybe those bus stops may become more frequent with demand. Because you might have a bus that goes through a route that doesn't stop, and therefore it's no use to anyway.
Are you suggesting, perhaps through Mr. Campbell, a potential change to UFD 13 there?
No, I'm not. But if we consider, I mean, a node is potentially, when I first read it, a transport hub. But it could be as small as a bus stop, and if that's the intent, then that's fine.
Do you think UFD 13 is clear in its intention in terms of its interim guidance version? Is it open to interpretation?
It possibly is, but it could be strengthened to add to that. Yeah.
Mr. Campbell, are you able to give some thought to that? Thank you.
I don't have UFD 14 in front of me, but I thought the word was short to medium rather than short.
Segregates it into short to medium and then long term.
That's right.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Yes, so the reason I raise that, Mr. Ray, you preface your underlying in 8.2 was short term, actually. So that's actually short to medium. This is hence my questions of Mr. Liggett about what are we talking about in years?
Well, I agree. In listening to those answers, I was just thinking about some of the developments that we're doing now, potentially greenfield developments, and 2 in particular, which are quite large, 50 hectares and 100 hectares. Mm-hmm. The first is 6 to 7 years in the making, from plan change through to delivery of the subdivision. Mm-hmm. And some housing. I can't give you the percentage, but in the 50 hectares it was established around the 700 dwellings, and there's probably, I'll be guessing, 50 houses developed. So in terms of what Mr. Liggett's talking about, the 10-year horizon, it does take that amount of time to achieve these outcomes. The second option, example is 100 hectares that started 1 year later, 5 years of development. Again, most of them, about probably half the development in terms of subdivision has been completed, being completed now. And there is a school being built to be opened in July, and around 100 houses which are being built, but there's no one living there yet. So that's some real life examples of the time it takes to develop. And these are developers who are very proactive in wanting to get that to market because of the value that was in the last few years. So they pushed really hard to develop more. Perhaps they might slow down from going for. At 8.3, I referred to Mr. Heath's evidence around, and look, you know, we have to rely on Mr. Heath's evidence. We didn't have any other economic evidence around this. So my point there is that he considers that in 10 to 15 years' time, that more medium density residential zoned land would be required to meet the demand, depending on how much of the fuzz land is utilised. At 8.4, just set out that there's obviously the intensification around the city centre is really a key driver from the council's perspective here, and I support that. The strategic direction is providing for the opportunity for other areas to intensify as well. And the question then is, how big should that be? What's the opportunity around that? In 8.5, we've canvassed through other discussions previously the opportunity cost in the short term and the lifespan of buildings. And so I just reiterate the fact that, you know, someone might develop a site because it's in the general residential zone, but actually in the longer term is a strategic bit of land which should be developed for higher intensity because it is in walking distance of the local centres and bus stops, etc. So at 8.6, I talk about really that I focused my analysis around the appropriate locations of that medium density residential zone and using the criteria that I've set out in 10. And look, it's always a question of what's the right criteria. And I've chosen to keep with the council section 42A report criteria because otherwise you're comparing apples with eggs or something. However, I've made some comments through there in terms of the support and how that sits with the strategic direction. And on page 9, the first actual bullet point there, it says consistency with the role and function of the notified zone. And I think I just wanted to point out again that there's a critical aspect of the different provisions before you in terms of the opportunities that are provided for by the provisions proposed by the Kāinga Ora witnesses versus the council's now position, not the notified position. So again, if perhaps, let's say, you choose to stay with the council's position on the provisions of the plan for the MRZ, i.e. 2 dwellings is permitted, you may then consider that you may need more land zone that now. So there is a package kind of consideration through that. At the bottom of that page, I point out that basically the notified application of the MRZ generally follows a landscape strategy where it is located on ridgelines or higher ground and not so much in the lower neighbouring valleys. And from a visual perspective, landscape perspective, this will enable the ability to accentuate that landform through build form. And if I just diverge there back to the discussion or observation around sunlight access, obviously the ridgelines provide more opportunity for good sunlight throughout the day. And if you're intensifying an area, you are going to get more shading from a bigger bulk. So you need to balance how much sun actually is delivered to housing and outdoor spaces. And look, the other aspect, which is probably another critical aspect fact, at the bottom of page 10, the compatibility or incompatibility with the overall strategy. And I just refer there to, if we're talking about around town centres, local centres and transport nodes, what does around mean? And I've just set out there that a good rule of thumb is a 10-minute walk or an 800-metre distance of a local centre. A 5-minute walk or 400 metres from a neighbourhood centre, and generally 200 metres from a bus route. It says I probably should clarify that to stop so that you can use it. And however, other discussions that we've been having in other places, particularly in Auckland and development of greenfield areas there, potential walkability is increased to around 1 kilometre or 1,200 metres. And that's not just about walkability, but it's also the opportunity for other modes of transport, such as electric scooters and electric bikes, which provide different modes of transport other than just a vehicle and a walk. And that's becoming more appropriate and used by commuters for access.
Nicholas, just a question about the bus routes and the bus stops. I've seen quite a lot of recent evidence of councils from the Regional Land Transport Committee introducing a sort of an app-based dial-up a bus van that will come and pick you up within 100 or 200 metres and will give you time that will be there, rather than the traditional line routes that we see. That's going to be a factor in the future, isn't it? We're crystal ball gazing about all of these things. So those transport bus routes, train routes, perhaps a bit more solid, but certainly seeing some changes in that area. Are you familiar with?
I'm not familiar with that particular example, but I've always been advocating, work we've been doing in Takanini, for example, for years, where there's a chicken and egg. The Auckland Transport still has not enough population to support a bus network to the train station. And then what happens? They build 3-car garages and they put cars in there because of the service. And so they go, well, there's no point anymore. And there's a question around, the actual contracts you have with bus companies, right? So if the bus contracts say that you're going to use these buses, well, that's what they use, and they're maybe too big. It might be better as minivans, more flexible and more Uber-like, let's say, then that provides greater accessibility. Yeah.
Okay, just to by the way, it's worth watching, I think. Just a check on how we're doing listening in from the Zoom. How are we going there, Hamish? Is that better if you're there? Or
Yep, I've turned the volume right up, so I'm catching most of it now.
most of it? Okay. Yep, we'll continue to do our best. I think Nicholas is perhaps louder than some of us, so keep your voice up.
I must say I did have the same problem presenting to you last week, and that's why I was wearing headphones to try and understand. I couldn't listen, I couldn't hear it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Apologies, I should have said something.
Yeah, certainly reach out if you can't hear. Okay, thank you.
And look, at the top of page 11, that just sets out, I looked at the MPSUD direction around applying intensification around the Tier 2 urban environments. And again, that's that policy 5, which Mr. Liggett talked about. But I think in the context this would mean greater intensity and height should be located around centres and those supported by public transport and cycleways, of which there are quite a few in which I might add, which is really good to see. The reverse sensitivity effects, I won't dwell on that, but that has been a consideration, particularly around some of the recommendations around industrial zoning versus mixed use zoning. and also MRZ zoning around some of the zoning near the hospital, for example, industrial zoning around the hospital area in West Town. Because I think there's a greater opportunity there than what we have presented, but it does come to the scope of, you know, or no scope perhaps of changing that industrial zone to a mixed use zone, which may better enable that intensification to occur, but it seems to be in a great place. The adequate provision of infrastructure at the bottom of page 11, I've just stated there that I don't understand that there's any major restrictions around that, and it's not a key driver in terms of the location of intensification. And your strategic direction there sets out that there's an expectation for use of existing and upgraded or new infrastructure to support that. So to put the infrastructure in to support the strategic direction. Site connectivity is very similar in terms of street connectivity, bus route, cycle lanes, but we are trying to achieve a well-connected neighbourhood for walking and cycling, and that supports a greater intensity. Site suitability around topography. I've just stated there, you know, to need to manage the risks around where we put greater intensification, land instability, or flooding, or sea inundation, etc. And it's probably one of the reasons why I've veered away from some of the flatter land in Waitara, for example, which is kind of very at level with below the stop banks in that area.
Certainly near Plymouth, we agree that topography is quite a challenge.
It is. And look, I'd say to that, it's also a really good opportunity too. So if you're going to spend a lot of money on building a retaining wall to build one house, can you spread that cost over a number of houses that benefit from the fantastic views that provides, right? So it helps with the feasibility of actually developing some of that land as well. And I say that generally, right? There's obviously geotechnical and all the other aspects to consider around that. But, and scheduled or landscape features at the bottom there of page 12. I consider that this is the zoning application is one aspect, and the other aspects which are managed through overlays to deal with some of these matters are in addition. And so I've reflected on my view shaft evidence earlier, sometime last year, where we had been recommending effectively an overlay type provision in terms of zone something, but have an overlay that manages height or intrusion into those zones. And for example, there is one site on the northern side of Marslands Hill where I think in that evidence I said perhaps shouldn't be upzoned to MRZ. On reflection to that, what's the problem with that site being low in height but 3 dwellings? So it provides an intensification in a good proximity to open space in the city centre, but it may not be able to be as high as the zone would enable because the view shaft overlay controls that or you know, manages that. So what I'm saying there is there's a consideration around density versus bulk and scale. And perhaps if I just diverge a little bit onto the effects that Mr. Littlejohn raised around the different zones and where we apply them and how does that manifest, then the proposal for greater site coverage and height as per the council's current recommendation in terms of MRZ provisions enable a bigger bulk than the general residential. Okay, it's got lower site coverage and height, 8 metres versus 9 metres. But permitted activity status of that does not enable that bulk to be used by any more than the housing, the number of housing that's enabled in residential. So you might enable more site coverage, more intensification, more impact on the environment without actually giving any benefit to more people living in that building.
That, comment on that, when the time came, but I think we'll try and get around to the, I mean, you've effectively narrowed it down now to about 12 sort of discrete areas as I see around the urban areas. And I think we probably will try and get out to most of them and have a look around, but in thinking that through, I'm also trying to imagine what we'd be imagining, because to some extent on the current proposition, as you've just pointed out, the permitted development scenario is only really just a slight increase in bulk and height. And so all we'd be imagining when we go out to these locations is potentially slightly bigger houses on these sections. And it only really then, the only way we really imagine anything significant is to imagine Kaungaroa's proposition, which is potentially 3 dwellings on those properties as a permitted scenario. But even that becomes problematic because ultimately it might be 3 dwellings, but the overall bulk is still going to be within the limits that we've proposed for 2. So I'm just sort of wondering what we're going to be thinking we're seeing, because the real difference here is only going to be in bulk and location. You're not going to potentially see, a much greater density of built form.
Well, I think just in that, I mean, the provisions proposed by Kaungaroa do include greater height. So
yeah, slightly.
So there is the opportunity to really achieve 3-story development. Right. And if I can just elaborate on that aspect, I find personally in my work that when you go in for a resource consent for a building that's over the standard height, it's really difficult, and particularly in Auckland, it's seen as a limit. Whereas, as you know, the restricted discretionary allows you to go higher than that with good reason. And so again, it's just balancing that aspect of enabling versus control and when to do that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, based on the hearings last week, I don't think there's a disagreement between council planners and Kaungaroa that 3 stories is appropriate for the medium density zone. It's just a difference of view as to what's the appropriate metric to make sure that can get achieved without difficulty. So I think there's quite a fine distinction there between the 2 parties.
So then answer your question around what you might see, and it's quite possible that you are going to see in some of those areas 3-story terrace type dwellings, and perhaps around, and I'm picking my priority where I think it should happen first, other than the city centre around West Town, there may be some apartment type walk-up buildings that are 3 stories.
Yeah.
And particularly if you can amalgamate sites. So the environment through this opportunity could change quite dramatically. But you're quite right, it may not.
Yeah, I mean, because there's an assumption that upzoning suddenly turns everyone into a developer. If that's not the case. Some people have had land in their family for generations and just quite like the idea of having a single house on it, with a yard and a place for the trampoline and that sort of stuff. I mean, to some extent, I mean, case in point, our property in Auckland was upzoned to 3 as a minimum, but in deciding whether, when we knocked down the 50, 60-year-old house that was leaking bits, it didn't even cross our minds that we might build 3 on the site, because it was the neighbourhood was all single houses and we just wanted 1 house. So, even though we knew that there was a potential for a greater development outlet. So it's one of those factors that plays into, I think, the comment you made, that many areas are slow at realising the opportunity, because it's made up of thousands of individuals who have thousands of different things playing on their mind about what they want to achieve.
And I think also the comment you made is amalgamation is going to be critical to achieve some of those additional units too.
That requires cooperative neighbours.
So I explained that to Mr. experience is I have just sold a house and it was right next to a local centre shops. And I loved living there because it was my fridge. Right? But I didn't enjoy so much the noise aspect of it, and we have young kids and anyway, I saw the opportunity through what we do because it's zone mixed housing urban. Our sites are 450 square metres, and the neighbouring sites are somewhat improved, but could get to a point where you could take them off pretty easily and put in. And I suggested to them, why don't we do that? Why don't we put all these houses somewhere else? And we build 6 terraces, 3 stories, great views, great outcome. Ticks the box, achieves the objectives of the zone, right in the right place.
Common fridge.
Common fridge. The middle guy was quite happy living in that single house, and the whole opportunity fell over. The other aspect is that I had 2 offers from developers for my personal house in that same one. Both of those offers fell over because they couldn't quite make it work because the land value was too high. So there's capacity, but then there's the feasibility. And whilst the house is kind of at a point where it's not really over spec, but it's quite livable, when do you knock it over? Now that's an it was built in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question and getting in whether you sat in and listened to yesterday's proceedings, because we had very good, robust discussion with Mr. Robinson and some of the other council officers about the difference between plan enabled, providing minimum capacity, and the fact that I think as Mr. Liggett identified, there are significant differences between plan enabled and actually delivered housing. So that has a direct application to giving effect to the SUD about capacity.
And a real estate agent made the comments like, oh, where you've moved to, it's a lower zone, so it's not as valuable because you can't do much on it. And then he said, but the MDRS was going to apply for the whole lot, so it's going to equalise that opportunity across the whole, which is actually, I think, going to have an impact. And I'm not speaking as an economist, but from my personal perspective, I think that's going to start reducing this difference in value from general residential to a higher zone band, and therefore, hopefully, making it more feasible to develop.
The 2 operative words there are enabled versus mandated.
Correct.
And MDRS is not mandating an outcome, enabling an outcome.
I think there's another play on words, talking about feasible. I think what you're talking about is also viable, so it may be feasible,
yes,
but the viability will come down to the ability to actually make this work financially and with enough space to meet the standards and those sorts of things. So certainly a lot of the business case work we do, there's a clear distinction between a feasibility outcome and a feasible outcome and a viable outcome. So
Just on that, the other point which Mr. Liggett made and was made in the last hearing as well, is that's why the non-notification is so important.
yes,
In terms of certainty, because that's the other key element, feasible, viable and certain,
yes,
and they all interrelate.
yes.
And you're not going to get a developer to take a punt on a 3-story building if it's going to be an 18-month process plus appeal right plus, and you go, well, I'm just going to build 2 stories. Now that's so in terms of actually maximising, that's why Crime Board spent that time saying, well, in this area and this side. Because we checked at the break, I don't think we asked for that notification exclusion in city centre. We did in the residential.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving to the actual assessment at page 13, I've started off talking there about the mixed use zone.
So just pause there.
And I think it's might be useful to.
Yeah, I've written a big note on your evidence need met in context. And I'm not sure how best to do this because we've got, help us with how best to do this. We've got the new plans, but also broken into.
These are the ones that are attached to my book.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to be, so on the back of Mr. Campbell's evidence, appendix B, the same maps, and if we could maybe bring that up.
Bring those up and just.
Bring Mr. Campbell's evidence up on the screen, and then you can go through.
Yes, so we'll just take a break while it happens, just for a quick comfort stop.
But the A3 maps are the same as Mr. Campbell's.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so I think that would help me go through each of those, and my thinking was, let's present this both between Michael and Nicholas, just together, in terms of the planning thinking. I think that would be really beneficial. Yeah.
Can we have a chat about timing after a possible break too, just in terms of people's flights? And
Yes,
things
so
like
when,
that?
when Kit comes back, we'll do that.
Yeah. I think that's.
Sorry, hearings administrator, I've forgotten your name already.
Christine.
Apologies. Thank you. Could you start with on the top of each of those is, go to the next page is an area. Area 1. So if we can start with area 3.
Sort of correlate.
I think I'm going to follow the evidence rather than
Yes,
the
well,
plans. Is that all right?
Yeah, no, that's good. We need to do it one way or the other. Yeah. Maybe just each plan, like if you can say, you know, that I'm dealing with paragraphs 11.1 to 3 of them on this plan.
Yeah, sure.
You just try and get some correlation.
Or should we just point to it? I mean, I could literally just take you through each of these areas.
Yes, without reference to your specific.
Without
evidence, or
trying to
do that.
do that.
I'd certainly be happy for you to put on the outside and Christine share this. That's gonna be the easiest.
Is it Bluetooth? Or? I think we need to use the mouse because
No.
see it, right?
Will that reach from there?
We can try.
Yeah.
So just before we get going, let's talk about timeframes today. I've got a 12:15 to 1 o'clock meeting. So I'm gonna break 14 and come back at 1:15 so I can get some lunch. What are your constraints?
I think there might be some of us on the 3:30, so as long as we can get away by 2:30, 2:45, that should be, I think that should be okay.
I think 2:30 would be a top tier date.
Yeah.
For time to get you there safely. Yeah.
Thank you. Touch and go. Should we go there? Yeah, let's do that.
We're just orientating ourselves.
Yes,
I think we do want to go out.
Oh, we do. I
And
think.
then maybe we fine for these guys. Later in the journey.
Okay, so let's just clarify what you're looking at here. what we've tried to do is present the proposed notified position, plus the changes that are recommended by the recording officer, and they are these areas highlighted in blue. At various locations. And the areas in the green outline are the areas that we're recommending change from that. And that's both mixed use zones, commercial zones, and residential. We'll start down here. Maybe we start here. So Spotswood is a bit of an outlier in terms of the city, the centres. It's mainly a suburban supermarket with a few takeaway shops. There's not a lot of other community facilities in there. The land where I'm pointing now, originally in the submission was to change it to a local centre. That's currently under development with residential, and there's probably not a lot of scope for increased local centre zone in there.
But maybe if I could just comment there. So as Nick alluded to, our submission sought that that was local centre, but because of the development that's literally underway, we felt that probably it's best to rezone it to medium density. There might be a question about scope, but kind of our thinking was that in terms of the local centre zone, residential is generally enabled in the zone, and so felt that there's still scope to enable a medium density. It's a slightly different zone, but I guess it's a lesser intensity zone than a local centre zone.
Can you use comment also on the heights and respective heights between the two as well?
I think from memory, we were seeking 11 metres plus 1 in the local centre zone, so the heights would be the same outcome in terms of our submission. Thanks, Bill. And you would have seen from the submission, we reduced the area. We went and had a look at that area. The mixed use land to the rear is quite a working area. It's kind of got a light, to my mind anyway, it's got more of a light industry type of activity going on there. There are some big plots of land at the end of Madden Road Street. A lot of that had topography issues, but a lot of that's actually a bit of a retirement village through the back there, which is, while it looks like a big lot, it's actually all sort of developed to a degree. So we tended to just focus the medium density just around the shopping centre. I shouldn't say shopping.
Local shops.
The one of the parcels, the one on the north side, called two parcels, and one separate called Great South Road. It's a very large undeveloped piece of land. That's
currently undeveloped.
Oh, that's the one that's got all the, you see the earthworks happening. Oh, okay.
There is another one which is actually at the back of that land, which is actually accessed off this cul-de-sac.
Which has an unbelievable earthworks excavation.
Oh, that's the one we saw. Yeah. Yeah, it was massive. Yeah.
So it's actually a hill, it's not flat.
Yeah, okay.
So look, there's some opportunity there and perhaps longer term opportunities there. But there is sites there that could facilitate intensification around that centre. Moving east, so Devon Street West is a pretty key arterial road right through the centre of New Plymouth, and has got bus routes, cycleways and things on it. And we looked at all of these areas through here from the city centre coming back out. And in some places, the proposed plan had mixed housing, medium density residential zone on elevated land alongside. And if you remember going through those spaces, it undulates up and down, and there's some in quite big cuttings with the landform above you. And some of those areas were already notified with the additional into the MRZ zone. And so the strategy of continuing the accentuation of that landform through height and building opportunity made sense. And you can see by this plan here that effectively it's following an offset from Devon Street West. These areas, for example, are down in the valleys and they're south-facing, and going back to those amenity aspects of sunlight and the development potential in there, and whether someone would actually build an apartment in there, we reduce those positions. The submission also included rezoning areas around this open space area here. It's actually a hill with the transmission station on top of it. And we considered rezoning around the centre, which from a centre perspective would make sense because of proximity. But due to the view opportunities of to that landform, and it didn't make sense to enable the height that we were talking through there, because it starts to impact the association with the views to those specific landforms, which haven't really been developed in a lot of significance.
As we're going through this, Nick, it seems to be that the original Kainora submission wasn't ground truth, or was it, in terms of the extent of the medium?
I wasn't
You
part
weren't
of
involved,
doing that.
but
No.
can someone help?
I guess during the submission process, we did go and do a brief ground check, and we did apply a sort of a metric using a kind of a key metric, and that kind of spatially identified the area when we sort of focused around the centres and along the transport routes. But probably what we didn't do is what we've done now, is I guess interrogated it more in terms of that issues of topography and.
Had you thought about taking some of the council planners with you on your ground truthing? Did that into your thoughts?
We did try and reach out, and to be fair, the council's been really helpful, but we've been busy.
Hard to.
Coordinate. Council's extremely busy.
Okay.
There's a comparison from black highlights, the new models,
Yes.
compared to the previous.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Just perhaps just roll through is.
So that's kind of a kind of justifications and how we've created, and we can kind of speed that up a little bit.
The only thing I might just mention on this map.
There's a couple.
There's a corner where we've proposed just to expand the local centre zone, which is an area which from memory is currently zoned light industry. It's on a corner. It features a kind of an old service station, sort of panel beaters, a sort of a menagerie, a sort of old sort of vehicle service oriented buildings and sort of light industry. And we've suggested that that's a good location to potentially expand the local centre. Where's that one?
Seaview and corner of
Seaview Road and Devon Street West.
Looks like a cross hatch, pink and red.
That's right.
Okay, but that hasn't changed. That was in the original, that was your
Original submission?
Original
Yes.
submission, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just drawing it because it's a little bit.
So there were a couple of locations mentioned yesterday where you'd previously sought either local centre, but now gone back to medium density.
Correct, and Spotswood is that example.
Spotswood's the example, that's right.
And whilst on this map, the Marfell development is in here, Discovery Place. And the submission includes land as highlighted, but also further to the south. And it would make sense through here if we're going to redevelop or rezone an area that's just been redeveloped. It's probably unlikely to be redeveloped again. There's not much potential there anymore. And so there is potential down Cook Street. There is a bus route down it. And if it's acceptable to zone that mix out MRZ there, then I suggest it should be expanded to either side of Cook Street and connect through to Seaview Road. Now, as we go through, and when you go out to site, you'll go to Seaview Road and you'll say, oh, this is in a valley. Yep. So there is aspects of the criteria where you might say, well, in general, it makes a lot of sense to be here, even though it doesn't meet all of them. So we've come up to here. We probably should split line, but So again, moving east along Devon Street West, there's areas around the schools, close proximity to existing centres north of Seaview Road, and in close proximity to the hospital. And areas that are elevated, such as this street, I can't remember the name of it, I should put it on there, for example, but it is elevated above and again provides the opportunity for those amazing views across the city centre and up to the sea. The biggest area of interest is, I think, in West Town, centred around the existing neighbourhood centres. Local centre, local centre, I think. Kaingora suggested that the other side should be his own local centre, and I agree with that. Uses within them are mainly non-residential, although there is a couple of two-storey sausage type flats in there.
So we're talking to Compass Street and Sanders Ave, that's
Correct.
West Town?
Yep.
There's a police
Police station and medical centre.
and medical centre on the other side.
So the zoning that's proposed around there, the notified is really good, but we see the opportunity to expand that from a walkability perspective, following Ridgeline's locations to open space, Western Park, Sanders Park, Yarra Stadium, for example. But also the proximity, as I discussed before, to the Taranaki-based hospital, and the employment opportunities that provides along with the industrial area around there. So people aren't all going to go into town to work, and there's possibly people coming from other areas to the hospital to work as well. So I believe that there's a real opportunity to intensify development around there. People can live, work, and play in the same place. And you'll note that we've reduced that recommendation. Kaingora had recommended the area where I'm pointing to now, south of Lawton Street. Again, that falls away to the south. There is some opportunity in there, but it is more removed from a walkability perspective than bus transport networks. But there is opportunity to further intensify that potentially in the future.
You've largely just looked at one section depth, really along there.
In that case, we have decided that because of the topography and how it falls away, and that section depth generally relates to the street. And so you could imagine greater intensification along that street as a build form and retaining a more suburban outcome to the south.
Ray, what would be really useful from my perspective is a third set of maps that just oppose the dark green line on the original submission.
We contemplated that. Yes. And we can provide that.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Just for my own orientation, the area, Seaview Road, Devon Street West, that local centre there, what's that called?
it's Lynmouth.
Oh, that's Lynmouth. There's another little bit towards the sea there as well. Yep. Yep. Thank you.
So this is a more substantial centre with a small supermarket and a greater
Yes.
offering.
Yes.
This is more of a working kind of centre, mixed use environment.
Yes.
Seems to be a lot of accidents in the city. There's lots of panel beaters around. As I noticed.
Keep the costs down.
I'll point out this area between Cupfield Road and bordering Sanders Park and Western Park. This street actually is interesting that it doesn't actually connect. It's the topography is effectively a landform plateau which stops about where my finger, my pointer is, and it drops away to the north quite dramatically. So So this part of the street, whilst the whole land is zoned road, it only exists as a cul-de-sac to a portion, and then a cul-de-sac at the top. So the block is actually quite distinctly different.
Oil Place goes from one point, then it starts off again as Bracken Street on the other side.
Originally, I recommended that that wouldn't be upzoned because of the valley and the scale and the typology of the buildings that are in there. However, given its proximity to the city centre, we decided that it was appropriate to upzone it. The likelihood of it changing is probably relatively low. Moving north on Cutfield Road, the Kaingaroa submission suggested, requested that the corner site here, which is currently a car yard plus a couple of other uses behind it, be zone to mixed use. And we've considered that through that view sharp discussion previously, and I support that. It's on a corner. It could actually have quite an important landmark type building and outcome at that location, and contiguous with the existing zoning to the east of it. Moving towards the city centre, Dawson Street. So these two blocks here were recommended in the submission for mixed use. We've previously talked about that, and I've recommended those potentially being an overlay with the living environment.
I can't see your cursor. Right at the top.
Right up top. Yeah, right. The green area up there. Interesting, it's slower on the screen, sorry. So these two blocks here were submitted as mixed use. I'd recommended originally that that could be included in the living precinct in the mixed use zone. And this is one of the areas we've kind of pulled back a little bit on that. There is fairly significant existing development in the northern side of the northern block. There is opportunity on the southern side and for redevelopment, and so we're suggesting in that one that both sides of St Albans Street are mixed use. The southern side has a greater proportion of current mixed use activities in it and relatively low quality building stock. The northern side has one non-residential use in it, and some Kaingaroa properties in that one.
Block immediately to the east. Up there wandering around last night. The block on the corner there used to be the Quilliam building, sold and converted into apartments. You go along the walkway goes on this side of the railway along there, and it's probably about 4 large houses being built. So sort of the mixed use there seemed a bit of an anomaly. It's purely residential, that triangular block there, but I suppose there's no way to sort of run through that. But it's a wonderful location for living. I mean, because there's so few trains. It's a really big setback to the water, if you like the wind, I guess.
And the proximity to the town.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. I remember there used to be a little
little
bookshop cafe on the corner there.
So in that regard, still recommend the living zone precinct, overlay on it.
Because the mixed use doesn't really disadvantage residential, does it? If it's got that living overlay. Right, yeah. And the height limits are about the same with medium density. Yeah, so.
Depends on where you land on the mixed use line.
Question was paused there, and just come back to us, come back on answer that question about the height in those two. This is pretty helpful, guys, so we'll just continue through after lunch. So we'll turn at 1:15. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah,
couple of beeps and we're underway, I think, Christine. So we'll hand back Nick and Michael to take us through. We might be up to area 3 on the sheet, hopefully.
Right, thank you.
You did have a question. We're going to come back on height between the two zones, local centre and mixed use.
Mixed use zone is
17 and a half.
16 plus 1.
Okay. That's a different small apartment sort of style. Okay.
3 stories.
Okay, so area 3, have it on the screen now. Sorry, the name is Lower something. I've just lost the
Lower Town.
Lower Town. Thank you.
Call it Carring.
So look, this area here again is centered around a small local neighborhood centre shop offering up on the higher ground, consistent with the submission. It starts to head down into the valley closer to the city centre. And again, basically for the same reasons we've discussed before, walkable distance on a bus route, cycle routes, and doesn't drop down into these valley systems which you actually access from other rear lots. To the west of Coronation Ave, that was an area where we originally didn't think it was entirely appropriate just because of its proximity or slightly further distance from the city centre. However, the offering provided by the local Technology Institute provides an opportunity for intensive residential development to support that facility, along with the boys' high school. And there's also bus routes along that street. So there's actually an opportunity here, while it's slightly different offering, there's some employment plus education facilities there from a wider perspective. And to the north of that,
Just on that area, is there, and someone will be able to answer this, is there any walking connectivity between that area and Victoria Park? Sort of, where you walk through the race course?
Yeah. Yes, there
Are there any linkage, are there any public walkways?
Public walkways on the opposite the southern access into Tokomaru Street. Yeah, so there's a connection through there
On this street.
and also on this street.
Yeah, but come along the bottom, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Rogan Street, you come along Rogan.
And you keep coming along Rogan Street.
When they do WOMAD, they allow people to camp up the top here.
Oh, yes.
When they did Rogan, I mean, it's been a while.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Just further to that, has there been any liaison with the race course in terms of whether they have any surplus or non-operational areas that they might be looking to dispose of? And the reason I ask is that
From our perspective, no, we haven't investigated that.
I'm just aware of the racing review and the closure of some race courses, but also where I hail from originally in Christchurch, Riccarton Racecourse had a large amount of non-operational land that they've since converted into a residential offering.
Definitely at Epsom as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, you raised
Oh, is that a couple of parks, horses, Campbell might have more information.
Just for the benefit of sorry.
Sorry, I was hearing two conversations and I didn't want to miss either of them.
I was just going to say, just for the benefit of the panel, they may be aware of this already, is the study that's currently going on regarding a multi-purpose venue in the racecourse area. So a large community sports hub facility. So there is a lot of groundwork and community consultation. Council has committed at a high strategic level to taking that project forward in the next few years.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Campbell, you were saying something.
Commissioner, I was just reiterating your point in relation to some of these facilities being sort of, I guess, repurposed to some extent, and as Commissioner Dace sort of alluded to, for example, Park and Epsom and Avondale Racing. Areas that have actually got residential developments underway.
Yes, I'm just conscious that at Riccarton, the residential development's well advanced, and the racing and residential aspects go hand in hand. Maybe that's for the next review of the district plan.
To the best of my knowledge, that is owned by the district council, but there's a lease over it, and there's complications with the lease to the jockey club. So that's another complicating factor.
Yeah.
In there as well. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no plans in the future for residential, and the focus is on the sports hub.
Yes, I was more interested whether there was spare capacity, and certainly I acknowledge the restrictions of lease arrangements. Certainly at Riccarton, there was a piece of legislation that went back to 1863 that had to be revoked. And special enabling legislation had to be created.
Anyway, in the interim, it's a great viewing opportunity from across the road, would support additional height. To the north of the boys' school, high school, this is another area where it was proposed to be mixed use rather than industrial, light industrial. The kind of activities in there are more, pretty low key, light industrial type activities, including the depot for the council parks department, I believe. And it just makes sense to be a more enabling zone that relates to the surrounding residential. Moving to area 4, the Fitzroy area town centre, so the reposition detail. To the left, there's proposed submission for mixed use to be extended over this block of land, which was proposed to be continued as light industrial or general industrial zone. As you can see there, that's surrounded effectively by residential development. And it's, again, the uses in there are more of a mixed use nature than an industrial type nature. And from a reverse sensitivity and other opportunities, it would make sense that it's more of a mixed use opportunity than industrial. Coming down towards the high school of the girls, which is effectively this land, and their playing field is in here. This is actually quite a short walk, and there's a set of traffic lights at this intersection, providing pedestrian access across it through to the mixed use opportunity over the railway, and then through to the town centre at Fitzroy. And this land is also elevated generally. The Waiwaka terrace is a bit lower. And arguably, if we had scope, I would have suggested to extend that further to the east, because there's a grade separated road crossing across State Highway 3 here, providing easy access through to the town centre as well. And there is opportunities for redevelopment in that area. It was out of scope though. To the east, again, this is a walkable distance, and we've selected these 2 blocks where there's really good walkability and development options in there, and along with this small block of land here. We looked at this industrial land here, which provides a small amount of employment, but it's mainly a turf, I think, concrete plant. But it does have quite good views across over the river, so perhaps a long-term thinking about what that should be. A lot of it's potentially flood prone at the bottom. And then coming further south down to Maryland's. So this Cumberland Street provides a connectivity across effectively the valley through to the State Highway 3, Coronation Avenue. It is somewhat removed from the city centre, but it has a local centre there. And submission was to zone the southern block of land on that corner, local centre zone. It's currently some 4 residential units, and long-term vision, I support that position as it can address that corner. Again, bringing in some of the urban design nodal aspects and opportunities to provide landmarks in that area. The opportunity for greater intensity around that centre is shown here, predicated basically on the upper levels of the landform around that centre and extending down to Maryland's domain. Covered that this area here on area 6 is the Vogeltown or Upper Vogeltown. Again, a small set of local shops on the corner here. And interestingly, the Countdown supermarket development has dropped down into the valley here. There's opportunity to provide some development in and around those two, between those two local centre zones. Particularly the housing stock there provides some opportunity there, as well as bus routes and cycleways, but also the local schools which are roughly in this area. Quite a lot of infrastructure and community assets that would support that.
I think we did look at whether or not the whole sort of block bounded by 40 Street, Brooklyn Road and Carrington Road could be sort of encapsulated, but I think when we felt the topography wasn't conducive to that sort of eastern area. But actually, the supermarket drops down to quite a sort of gully.
The Kaingaroa submission also had potential rezoning of the corner as local centre, but basically the topography would make it very difficult to achieve that. I think on area 7, we turn to area 8, Bell Block. So the focus of intensification is around the larger of the centre on the intersection, road separated, and providing easy access through to the employment opportunities to the south. Or is it east, southeast? And there's a small area of opportunity within there. The housing stock, in comparison, relatively new. And we considered around this centre, but we just felt that there was probably limited uptake in that area. So focus it on the area where there's a main connection through and across that would service and help to facilitate access to employment opportunities.
The housing stock, I guess, around that centre to the east is probably newer, and the subdivision pattern is probably a little bit more smaller lots anyway, square, smaller lots. There's actually already a sort of, you might say, single level sort of land type Union Street type properties.
Watra. So this area was considered reasonably heavily and landed on an additional area up on the hill here, across the road from the school, open space, as an extension to the proposal in here. There is opportunities up on other higher parts overlooking the rest of the small centre. However, there is some potential issues with locating that intensity next to general residential zone, industrial zone. So what that becomes in the future, that may change the opportunity in there. And at the moment, there's more opportunity in this older part of town, up on the higher elevated land. The other one was the small 4 sites within sort of more in the city centre here that seem to be left out. It makes sense to rezone that mixed use as well.
So I think that's us.
That's right, yeah.
Let's come back to the table and we'll pass again. So look, what I think we'll do is we'll take some questions for you now. Is that pretty much we've been through the covered off, it's all obviously written down as well. So looking at the time and whether there's any questions, starting with Kit.
I've asked the questions I had on your evidence. I'm still interested in what is the rate of uptake based on zoning? And I know we've got Mr. Heath on the line, and we'll probably have a chat to him later about this. And I know in the Auckland experience, when they went through the analysis to try and work out how much to upzone for, that just went on for so long to work out what's your appropriate margin for turning colours on a map into feasible development versus what actually turns up at the end of the pipe. And I'm just wondering whether there's been any, or you're familiar with any sort of monitoring or research coming out of Auckland as to what is being experienced up there following the increase in zoning. Now, to some extent, it's probably never going to give you a clear answer because there are so many other factors at play that impact upon housing outcomes in Auckland, particularly over the last few years. COVID, material supply, cost of building, labour shortages, all of those sorts of things. But are you aware of any? I know Auckland Council do in sort of an annual sort of here's the numbers outcome based on resource consents and building consents issued. And I guess you can derive some outcomes from there. But I guess I'm just still interested in what's turning up on the ground. If for every, can we say confidently, for every 1,000 square metres that you upzone, only 100 square metres of that gets developed in the short term? I mean, have we got any sort of science around this at all, or are we just sort of thinking of a number and doubling it, assuming that it's never going to be achieved at the rate proposed anyway?
Well, I can start, and I probably was going to defer it to Mike, but yeah, I don't have that analysis, and I think, I mean, that's critical issue about how much do you do and when, right? And I think it's quite difficult.
I mean, similarly, I don't have any empirical information about that. What I would observe, I guess, anecdotally, is, to my mind, when you look at what's happening in Auckland, and you look at particularly where the most development appears to be concentrating itself, it does tend to seek out areas along public transport routes, and it does tend to locate in areas around centres. They are seen as attractive areas. So if you I think of Auckland examples, for example, Great North Road that runs from Ponsonby to Greyland. That was formerly an industrial type sort of service area. If you go along that area now, it's developing quite intensively with apartment style housing. It's on a ridge line. It's got great views. It's close to amenities like Ponsonby, Greyland Park. It's got good public transport. It's close to the CBD. So that's an area that, particularly any site that comes up, gets developed really quickly. And the transformation of a road like that is quite significant. It's an arterial road. As opposed to, for example, another example might be Lincoln Road in Henderson, which apart from all its fast food joints, hasn't really developed. And because it doesn't have that same level of, I guess, attractiveness in terms of the proximity to a range of sort of things that are attractive. And also, I guess what I've observed is once you provide that greater enablement, it does provide, I guess, an incentivization for people to kind of hunt out sites that are close to amenities.
It's a question of what's the appropriate level of incentivization to actually, I guess, kickstart it. And I mean, the debate we had yesterday is you've got to provide almost a carrot and a stick approach. If you want a compact city, you've got to make it slightly less attractive to develop further from the centre.
Yeah.
But comparatively, if you're not going to make it that hard, you've got to make it comparatively more attractive to develop closer to the centre. Yeah.
That's right, and that's why I think, and we touched on it this morning, it's not just a spatial issue, it's a package that talks about the rules, it's around the process in terms of notification certainty for people who are looking to acquire a piece of land. I think, hey, this is a good piece of land, it's got all the attributes in terms of proximity to amenities, then that will need certainty around actually delivering.
Well, there's an issue, we're talking about it now, but it's questions I was going to ask you anyway, Michael. What degree of, I mean, it's a pejorative term to use it, but what degree of oversupply do you need in order to provide a realistic incentive?
It's a really good question. You are sort of moving quite a flexible target in terms of enabling a plan, and that's, I guess, that theoretical potential. And so, it's difficult, I think, from my perspective, to land on a metric. It's interesting if you look at what central government's done with the Housing Enabling Act and the NDSR standards. I appreciate that, New Plymouth is not located in a tier 1 authority, but I guess the point there is they're not really making a sort of a nuanced approach in terms of the supply of medium-density housing. Basically saying turn the tap on that being provided across the city. I guess it does just come down to that flexibility, because as we talked about this morning, no one site is equal. There are a whole range of circumstances that will prevent the site being from developed in terms of what's on the site, in terms of existing infrastructure, shape factors, the desire of the landowners and things like that. So, you can certainly see in the Auckland context, there are a number of examples of areas that have sort of tended to develop a lot, and in other areas that are just not, that potential hasn't been taken up.
I'll just jump in there. Yeah, sure. And that's a question that will be put to Mr. Heath.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, from a planning perspective, does the MPSUD provide any guidance on that? I know it talks about margins, but that might be margins in terms of ensuring that capacity is there, but that may not be referring to the difference between potential and realistic delivery.
That's right. I mean, I probably have to reflect on that, but I think there's one issue of capacity, and I think that's important to make sure that it's there. But it's also, I think you can go beyond that in terms of incentivization, and particularly incentivization versus other typologies, maybe greenfields type.
Can you recall what the margin is in the MPS? Is it 15 to 20%? So 20%. So that's a different concept, though, isn't it? That's on the total capacity, isn't it? As opposed to the realisation of that potential capacity, which is more of maybe a question to Mr. Heath.
That's right. Yes, and I think there's also there's the capacity and enabling issue, but there's also that issue we've talked about, I guess, the life of the plan versus a longer term view, and that sort of issue around not foreclosing areas that, from a planning perspective, yes, they meet a supply metric, but they also meet an urban design outcome or an urban form outcome in terms of delivering a compacted form, and you're locating housing choice in your arrangement.
the MPS is, just to close that, the MPS is silent on that difference between enabling and actual delivery, but it talks about a margin in terms of total capacity provision.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's good. I've exhausted my questions anyway.
Commissioner McMahon, if you look, just for your benefit, if you look at 326 of the MPSUD, it does, it goes through the hierarchy of capacity, infrastructure ready, and then at 326, it talks about what's feasible and reasonably expected to be realised, and then talks about tier 1, tier 2. So that might provide some good.
So it doesn't have any metrics, does it?
No, I don't, well, not.
Thank you. 326, is that 3?
3.26.
I mean, just, sorry to in there. The NPSUD is structured in 3 parts: objectives, policies, and then implementation. The outline of the implementation part 3.1 says this part sets out a non-exhaustive list of things the local authorities must do to give effect to the objectives and policies of this NPS, but nothing in this part limits the general obligation of that to give effect to those objectives and policies. So it's sort of said, it's almost like saying this is the minimum you have to do to achieve the statement, but you can do more. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, from a legal perspective, and certainly I think the point there about that Mr. Ray is talking about is, putting your urban form where you want it to be, which the NPSUD won't get into that level of granularity. But you might choose to put it on ridge lines because of views or because of sun or urban form issues, which is something which I would be very helpful in terms of that ultimately realise that for.
I don't have any more questions.
For Mr. Ray, just solely on the topic of your assessment methodology, Mr. Ray, that you've outlined in your section 7, pages 4 and 5. And you've listed the sources and tasks and matters that you've addressed A to K here. And I just wanted to start with item C, which is the criteria used in the Blue Marble assessment, which I think we also know as the residential B study.
That's correct.
And Mr. Bain has commented on the residential B study because he was the primary author of that back in 2018. And he said that given the specific assessment undertaken, I consider that the findings of the residential B study are still relevant and nuanced, and that the current medium density residential identified in the PDP is suitable. That was paragraph 4.5 of his statement of evidence attached to the 42A. He also said that the 2018 residential study in part informed the PDP medium density zone extent, the spatial extent, used a more detailed set of criteria than used by Kainora. And in preparing the study, we visited all the streets to assess individual characteristics. That's Mr. Bain speaking. So based on that, do you disagree with any of those statements that Mr. Bain has made?
So through my work, I have looked at those matters in more detail to now come up with the revised zoning pattern before you.
Yes.
So the nuanced aspects that Mr. Bain talks about, I have considered as well.
Yes.
And we perhaps at a difference of opinion in terms of where exactly those changes may occur.
Okay. In your item here, on page 5, you say you've assessed the criteria used in the section 42A report and commented on its suitability. Is that, how do those criteria relate to the criteria that were in the 2018 study, Mr. Bain?
So it's interesting you say that. So there's a range of criteria that's been used by various reports and people. I've selected the 42 because it's the most recent.
Yes.
And I have in paragraph So on page 9, bullet point 2, I refer in there to the criterion is, it's a context, right? Spot zoning, consistency with surrounding land uses. The criterion is an important consideration. This is where the finer grain landscape criteria used by Mr. Bain appropriately sits. So I believe that there is a wider criteria list applied in the 42 than just those particular aspects of it.
Right.
Yes.
In any event, you've used the same criteria as the 42A.
With consideration of those criteria that Mr. Bain has looked at as well, in terms of like landscape views.
Okay, just moving back a step, you mentioned that you had recourse to look at the criteria used in the Whangarei and Waikato district study. Were you involved in that study, or were you using it as a methodological
check? So as the MPSUD talks about, a council can select the criteria it uses to select these areas. So I didn't want to confuse you further, perhaps, with adding another set or a different set. So I've tried to explain the importance of the criteria used and attempted to use that through my analysis.
Yes, and are you suggesting to us that the Whangarei and Waikato district criteria are an example of temporary good practice?
Oh, yes, I'd say so. Yes, it's recent case law.
Has that been tested in the courts?
I believe it's gone through a similar process to this.
I can help. So the Whangarei one, that was settled in mediation, but there was quite detailed consent orders, and that resulted in
712.
Yeah. Total. Yeah. But that was, what was the change? That was the change.
Went from 220 hectares to 712 hectares. Don't quote me on the decimals of those numbers, but it's that kind of magnitude.
And Waikato?
I wasn't involved.
Waikato is for courts now, so we've got to start.
Oh, of course it is. Yes. Those decisions were just
been released.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a similar magnitude between the notified plan and the decision.
Okay. So Mr. Ray, before you and Mr. Campbell stepped out of and onto the site visit train, so to speak, you had a thorough look at the various criteria and tried to amalgamate those used by the council with contemporary best practice and criteria used by central government, such as the Ministry of the Environment. Then the process was full day assessment, walking around, looking at individual constraints and site
Yes, so
features.
Prior to that, I spent considerable time on Street View in Auckland. So I went around all of this more than once, in virtual and then on site. So that was the process first, to refine the maps, and then the ground truthing was to test that further.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, we also, basically 2 days with USHA evidence, so we're quite confident with that.
And undertaking the exercise, were you informed at all by the leader about the capacity targets that they were looking at?
Not that those are the first time I've heard those numbers today.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you for your assistance.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
I've been told to speak up a bit more, so I'll speak a bit louder. Normally, you've traversed a lot of discussions before you get to me. So
I think we better just do questions
if you're comfortable with questions,
Yeah.
I'll also be two comments.
Two comments?
Or two or three comments before.
Sure.
One was just in terms of the spatial change, I just thought it might be helpful to explain the change. We did a quick, I have to caution, very quick measurement of the existing New Plymouth urban area in terms of the extent of our submission seeking medium residential zone, and that amounted to in the order of 24.7% of the urban area we were seeking to be medium density residential. Our revised position, following obviously our updated evidence, reduces that down to 6.2% of the urban area. I'm sorry, I can't give you a square meterage, but I just thought it's just as a.
No, that's fine, but how do you define the urban area?
Is it all the colours shown on there?
Correct.
Block and white. That's not rural.
That's correct.
Everything that's not rural.
That's correct.
Does it include industrial?
Yes, it includes that urban area. So I probably, we did that just to provide you a difference in the.
Yeah, that's not precise because you've got lots of it. You've got Egmont Village and Nipperton and.
Exactly.
24.7% in the revised.
6.2.
It's 75% reduction.
About a quarter of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
That's helpful.
And Commissioner McMahon, you raised the issue of section 32A.
Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. I'm more than happy to update that and provide a supplementary section 32 to address those matters.
Appreciate that. Do you think it's possible to provide the similar percentage breakdown for the residential area into percentage terms?
We can do. There's probably a little bit of granularity that with the way the GIS is working for us is we may not be able to exclude all the roads, but I think if we were consistent in our approach, it would still give you a percentage.
It's about the big picture.
Sure. Yeah.
That would be useful.
So there was one clarification. Was there anything else?
That was it.
So I think we'll start again with Kit.
I guess just thinking through the trying to get council's approach to the submissions as close as possible to, I guess, where Kaingaora have approached their analysis. And I guess it comes down to the analysis against the criteria. And to some extent, Mr. Ray in his evidence has really done that in quite a narrative style. You've broken down each of the areas to West Town, Spotwood, and you've included a couple of paragraphs there about why you think those are good to have and that sort of thing. And of course, the council planners have sort of approached it slightly differently, and you would have seen their appendix 3 to the section 42A report, where they go through and admittedly, they don't do it for Kaingaora because it was, I think the submission was way too big to fit in the table. But for each specific site, they've gone through and they've got an analysis where they pick out those criteria that are seen as a cost of accepting the rezoning request. And then in another column, they've got, again, picked out those criteria which speak to the benefits of the request using Mr. Bain, I think the criteria they've listed in the 42A report. And yeah, I'm just wondering whether there's any way that when you perhaps rethink about the detail of the section 32A assessment, you could potentially do that for the revised Kaingaora position. Although I don't think, my current thing, I haven't chatted to the other commissioners, is that doing it on a site-by-site basis is just not efficient. But maybe there is a benefit in doing it for your 12 areas that you've identified. And maybe, so basically turning what Mr. Ray has put into a narrative description and as evidence about each of these areas and why they're retained, putting those into a table whereby you use the criteria to identify which ones would be a cost by reference to the criteria. And I'm happy if you use your slightly revised criteria because you've effectively adopted Mr. Bain's criteria and adapted them to some extent, just so that we sort of can compare apples with oranges a little bit. I think that would be quite useful as an addendum to the 32A. So do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's not that much more work than what you're probably possibly going to do.
It's documenting what we've done. So.
Yeah, and it's sort of using the same metrics in terms of why is this good and why is this bad that the council have used. And so then we can sort of get you both talking the same language to some extent.
And Kat, if it helps, the council already done that in relation to some of the specific rezoning requests in the appendix 3.
Yeah. Right.
And so they've got benefits and costs columns, and they've put the criteria where they relate to the benefits and costs into those columns. So I think your one probably needs a little bit more detail. But these ones that I'm referring to were fairly simple ring-fenced sites as opposed to the 12 areas that you were looking at. Yeah.
I hate to ask you to do more work, but I mean, it just assists us to then identify where are the differences of opinion, because decision makers like to narrow the differences of opinion because it means the amount of work they have to do to sort of disappoint one or the other, one party or the other is a lot less. So that's fine. Yeah, no, that'd be appreciated.
Could I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about area base, can we talk about the different zones in that each of those areas as one?
You might have to.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, we'd have a table that's got your 12 areas that you've identified for medium. And I think there's some where there's might be a little bit of, you've actually got your mixed use ones as well. I'm sort of less concerned about the mixed use ones. I'm more concerned about the medium density residential ones.
Focus on the medium.
You okay with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. I think just the residential additions over and above the 42A report.
For completeness, if you wanted to do a separate one for mixed use, that would,
Feel free.
that would assist.
We know you've got so much time on your hands.
Certainly assist me. Now for that chapter.
Yeah. I've written lots of things along your evidence, but I don't think they're questions to some extent. They're more paraphrase. Yeah. I didn't have any other specific questions. Anyone?
I've just got one, Mr. Campbell, and it's a little bit of a statement and a question. What I've observed is that what might be quite unusual is that Craig Aurora and council really relied on a single piece of evidence from Mr. Heath, but you've largely come to different conclusions about the how that evidence should be dealt with in the plan. Mr. Heath is 4.6. It says that I consider a combination of the two positions will provide the most appropriate economic outcome, specifically extent of the FUZ has to be reduced, and he talks about possibly pushing back Smart Road to 2051 and beyond. And he then also talks about retaining the notified extent of the MDRZ in the short to medium term, 10 to 15 years of revisiting it then. That's been largely adopted by Robinson. You've been relying on Mr. Heath's evidence and the groundwork that you've done. You've come to a different view about how the spatial extent of the medium density zone should be increased. Probably share the view about the need or otherwise for the FUZ. I wondered how have you landed on your position in terms of giving effect to the strategic objectives, particularly UDF 14? What's been the direction provided in that objective that makes you certain that increasing the spatial extent of medium density zone is the appropriate course of language to use the section 32 parlance when Mr. Robinson thinks that it's not appropriate, that the notified version is largely the most appropriate version, and he's relying on future plan reviews to fill the slack, if you like. What is it about the appropriateness factor? How have you come to the appropriateness decision that you've arrived at?
I guess at a while ago, I've stood back and I think I've taken a longer term view than the 10-year sort of life of a plan, and I've sort of taken a view of the urban form and the urban form that is, you know, most appropriate in the wider context. So I think the issues of supply are obviously important, but it also needs to be sort of added into the actual the ability to provide housing choice in different areas through different zones, and the ability to, you know, locate intensification in areas that are appropriate in terms of
Is that, I'm conscious not trying to put words in your mouth, so you agree that the footings is in two parts, a short, medium term and a long term?
Yeah, it is. But I guess my perception of that is it's about giving prioritisation to intensification from the get-go, but that doesn't end with a short-term or a medium-term outlook. As a long-term outcome, intensification will still be an objective.
Yes, I understand that. Is one of those tranches more aligned with urban form than the other?
In terms of the urban outcomes?
In terms of the method that UFD identifies for achieving capacity in the short term and medium term versus the long term, is one of those, is tranche 1 or tranche 2 more aligned to a compact urban form?
From my perspective, tranche 1 in terms of intensification and infill is more aligned. I think maybe to add to that, if I could talk about the Auckland context. Apologies, I don't like to be the Auckland planner coming in. But I guess what we're kind of seeing in the Auckland context, that just out of interest, is the Auckland plan has a kind of a 70-30-40 split in terms of intensification versus greenfield growth.
Yeah.
And underpinning that is a land release strategy that the council has, in which urban land is intended to be urbanised. The reality is that that's not what is bearing out in Auckland. What we're seeing is a significant number of plan changes at quite an ad hoc level. And you comment about positives and negatives of
For
that.
Greenfield.
For Greenfield. And so there isn't really, in the Auckland context, probably because of, I don't think the plan really gives enough teeth. There isn't really prioritisation of infill versus greenfields. To be honest, it's a gold rush. It's just kind of happening everywhere in a very ad hoc and fragmented way. And I guess, and I'm just saying that that's why it's important at the strategic level to differentiate between your infill and your greenfield.
So you think, Mark, sorry, but this plan guards against that outcome, do you think?
Good question. I think that policy is really important in acknowledging the short to medium term. And I think it's really important that that policy makes it clear that the future urban is a long-term, you know, aspiration outcome.
I mean, when you think about the Auckland Internet is a product of its thinking and of its time, and it was pre-NPS, UFC and UD. I mean, in a way, it was a little bit of an experiment to put in place some policy framework around intensification. And then everyone sort of learned a little bit now and realised, well, as you say, it is a bit of a gold rush. That there isn't really a mechanism by which the council can say no to a private plan change on the outskirts if the developer turns up and is able to fund all the infrastructure, even though it's completely out of sequence. Yeah. Whereas Whereas here, you've got to, we take the benefit of those learnings to some extent, and we realise that you've got to get these policy settings right from the get-go, don't you? Yeah.
And without labouring the point, it's really trying to give as much flexibility to the market and give a really clear signal to the market that this is where intensification and housing, the provision of housing is going to be directed.
Just if I can just add briefly to that. So, and I guess it comes back to the point I made about foreclosing opportunities. If Mr. Rowe and Mr. Campbell's right in saying these are the likely commercially attractive developable areas, and they're not zoned medium density, they're probably going to get developed in the next 15 years anyway, with general, and then your medium density is going to have to go somewhere else. So in 10, 15 years, you do a plan change, you might miss the boat.
I think Michael, so Mr. Campbell's, one of the key propositions he makes, and it's in paragraph 5.7 of his evidence, and it was the answer you gave to Commissioner McMahon, that you're just taking the difference between you and the council is you're taking a longer term view to some extent, and this is where this opportunity cost comes in, because you foreclose, and you look at the history of urban expansion is that, oh my goodness, we need some more room for houses, so let's just zone a little bit on the edge, and fuel, catastrophe averted until all of a sudden you've got another housing. Oh, we better zone a little bit more on the edge, and of course this NPSUD is sort of a bit of a shake-up. It's saying we've got to stop planning cities like that. We've got to do it differently, and we've got to provide a culture of change within our urban framework that actually embraces change. And to some extent, your view, and it's expressed in your 5.7, is that if you've got the opportunity to paint the big picture for the longer term, why not? What's the cost of doing that? It's not as if everyone is going to become a developer overnight and suddenly start building a whole lot of houses. But what if they did? Where's the downside? Yeah, where's the downside? And I think the other point of it is if you do take that long-term view, you can regularize the investment cost, because there's no longer a gold rush. People know that there's going to be this potentially available for a considerable period of time. There's no rush. In fact, land costs may even sort of come down a little bit, which actually opens up the market to more sort of ad hoc infill within these areas. Anyway, I'm just repeating your evidence back to you, so I'm sorry about that. But I think that is the key difference. It is a roundabout time frame and how far you plan and what's the benefit of planning for that bigger picture for the longer term.
My final question, I guess, is the elephant in the room about the FUZ. Clearly, the FUZ has posed some concerns for Mr. Heath in terms of what it would provide in the medium to the long term. In particular, we heard yesterday, I think, and I've just checked these figures, that the total capacity of the FUZ, if realised, was around 5,000. Yes, of which the Smart Road component was around
3179.
Yeah.
3179.
Yes, around about 2/3. And Smart Road. And yeah, I didn't have those figures. And that, as I said, that seems to worry Mr. Heath, and Heath will have a chance to respond to that. But what sort of comfort can you give us about the position of the FQZ in terms of both the short and medium term scenarios and the long-term scenario in terms of affecting capacity and affecting compact urban form?
Well, I guess in the short term, I think it has the real potential to impact on your strategic outcomes focused on compact urban form. In terms of greenfield land, I guess from my experience, it's the kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of developable land. It's kind of, dare I say it, easy stuff. And so
You are talking about the FUZ. Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate it's a future urban zone.
Yes, the holding zone.
Yeah, it is a holding zone, but I guess I can only relate this to the Auckland context. Is as soon as you create a future urban zone, it elevates it to more than rural. It does have the potential to create a lot of pressure in terms of the need for plan changes.
Is there anything that you've seen in the notified plan around policy level that would preclude that land coming on too early? Is there any provisions in the plan that would control the timing of the FUZ land being advanced through a first schedule process to?
Well, I think your strategic objectives for that in terms of
Or it didn't come to the FUZ hearing.
no.
And there is a particular policy there, P7, which is supposed to be here is the checklist to be satisfied before you can apply for a plan change. Which is, I always sort of found those policies a bit peculiar, but I mean, that's the only tool we've really got, unless you just don't colour it FUZ and don't manage that the right way.
So what is the position of FUZ and Smart Road? I wasn't clear whether
There's no submission that says
there's no
it shouldn't
submission
be.
that
future
says it shouldn't be. Kainora,
Kainora lodged a general submission that just said, generally review this future urban and potentially reduce it.
we don't have evidence on that hearing, no. So it's not up for our deliberations, is it, in terms of the Kainora future position?
Well, a submission, I mean, the submission, yeah, I mean, the spatial extent's one thing, which I'll come back to. In terms of the FUZ objective, obviously the Kainora submission is still before you, and you're entitled to have regard to that. And that makes it, it made it fairly clear, like I'm just reading it now. Future urban zones, the identified location for urban growth to ensure that this long-term urban development needs to provide for while ensuring the intensification of existing urban need is not compromised by the evidence affecting urban sprawl. So as an object, so that was the submission on FUZ. But I mean, I agreed with Commissioner Littlejohn. I mean, it's, you know, a lot of landowners who get their land zone future urban spend their money very quickly in their heads and then go and say, how do we? Well, the land prices go up because it's considered future urban. It's exactly what's happened in Auckland. And then everyone's going and paying ridiculous prices in the future urban zone and then thinking now we need to develop it because we spent all this money in our heads. That's what happens.
The question I was trying to get to, Mr. Campbell, is that the outcome in the UFD objective is clear in terms of timing for medium-term infill intensification and greenfield development areas, and in the long-term, FUZ.
Yeah.
The method for achieving the objective is less clear on my mind. We've got a holding zone, which we've been told is actually more stringent than the rural zone. But without giving you a leading question, I wanted, and Littlejohn's filled in the gap, I wanted to know whether you thought P7 was sufficient, was appropriate to control the timing aspects in terms of the P7. Okay, I'd like you to give some thought to that.
Yeah, I'd be quite interested in that as well, because Kainora's submission was quite specific about the wording it suggested for P7. Mr. Whitaker was the reporting officer on Future Urban, and we had a relatively robust discussion about what this policy was trying to do. And if you have a look at his right of reply version, I actually think it adopts some of the wording that you proposed in your submission, but I'd be quite interested for you just to, well, I guess what we're saying is we'd be happy to give you an opportunity just to give a view on it. I know the council have had a right of reply on the FUZ now, but it is part of the strategy here to try and make this sort of the highest fruit in a way, in the long sense. But the issue is how you write a policy that says people can't exercise their statutory rights, which is a no-no.
Prohibited activity policy. Although in the Heritage Plains, which Commissioner Day should be well aware of, you know, there was, I remember one infill subdivision application that got turned down, and the court said it's a less than minor effect, but from a policy perspective, if we let this happen, there's nothing to stop another one, and then another one, and there's another one. So it's probably going to come
more down to how strong your policies are than whether they're actually, whether you back them up.
Yeah.
Rotorua City is an example which relies heavily on FUZs to meet their long-term and in a sequenced manner. So they have a very detailed policy in their 11 works through the process for upzoning through scheduled process, the area identified as FUZ. So
Can you add that to your list?
Yep.
Just because we are circling back, we don't want to open up another go, but because it is seems to be such a key part of your rationale, Mr. Campbell, restrict FUZ for as long as you can until all the intensification or as much of the intensification opportunities can be delivered, and then look out further if you need to. That's as I read it.
Yeah, and Mr. Whitaker suggested even a new policy P8, which I don't know if you've got in front of you there, which is, yeah, we haven't yet deliberated on it, but you'll read it and you'll see what he was intending to do. It was sort of like, but before you start painting FUZ residential, you almost have to establish, based on development uptake within the other areas that were already zoned, that you're almost at that point where there's nothing left. How you prove that, I mean, I'm still struggling as to how an individual group of landowners prove that across the city. But anyway, it's
the money's there, they'll have a go.
Well, potentially,
yeah. And for example, that might not preclude the council accepting the plan change for notification, but it might go to your assessment of the merits of it once it has been notified.
Yeah, I have looked at that. Assessing merit and what the plan is proposing. Yeah.
You might want to feed that into your 32AA. So,
you'll never want to come back to New Plymouth. Every time you come here, you just take a whole lot of work back with you. That's all right. Excellent.
Thank you. Michael, I'll just have a couple of follow-up things. Thank you for your evidence. It's also an inherent contradiction in your paragraph 3.2 and 3.7. We talk about in 3.2 at the end, efficient compact urban development model, which is what you're advocating for, as methods of increasing housing choice and improving housing affordability. That's an affordability question. But then 3.6, we talk about greenfield land essentially being able to be more affordable. So you can't have it both ways, can you? You can't have both affordable. Yeah. Do you see a contradiction there at all?
Sorry, could you just?
Yeah. So you're talking about compact urban form as a method of improving housing affordability.
Yeah.
And then your 3.6 say the most affordable housing.
3.7.
3.7, sorry. 3.7. The most affordable is greenfield.
I guess I was making that observation which I made earlier, which is if all things
are equal,
yes, then there's always the risk if you kind of provide for intensification and infill, and at the same time you're providing for a significant area of greenfields land, you're increasing the supply. That there's no doubt, but you're probably, to my experience or view, you're going to encourage people to kind of tend to go after the greenfields land.
Yes.
So that was
which is the point I think we'll be talking about.
Yeah, you've got to make it easier to go.
How do you make it easier to get into infill and
that's right.
And intensification there for a compact urban form?
That's the point I was trying to make.
Okay, so that's good. The only clarification I needed. So I think everything else has been asked. So yes, there's a list of things to come back to. Probably it's a mixture of some legal advice and some other bits and pieces, but I'll let you package it up, Al, as you
Yeah.
see fit.
Can I just quickly run through my list? I
Mm.
think it's worth doing it. So future urban jurisdiction, read the maps. So that'll be a memo from me.
Yes.
Section 32AA analysis to be updated, cross-reference objectives and policies, comment on the MUG P7 and P8, analysis of the 12 residential areas and the MUS against the council's 42A criteria as they did their site-specific assessments. Comment on the question of transport nodes, and I think UFD 14, whether it could be what nodes means. Mr. Liggett to tabulate the figures he had and enter it into the canvassing process.
In advance.
Yeah, as soon as we can, we'll try and get it done.
With the
next week.
agreed statement of facts. Yep.
Yeah, combine the maps just to show the reduced area on top of the submission version.
Mm.
Basically what Mr. Liddell's probably done over his lifetime. And then provide a percentage residential area NDRZ submission version versus now.
And some commentary on the policy 7 matters.
Yeah, you mentioned
P7, I said that, P7, P8. FUZ, I think I said, rather than UZ.
Thank you. And just for the staff, we're reporting back on these all at the end of, the clock starts ticking for 2 weeks at the end of June, is that how we're thinking? Rezoning here in 22 is a package, so I just want to make sure that there's enough time to.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things I'm mindful of is I'm also the reporting officer for the residential zone, and there was a comment earlier about sort of how these matters are interrelated, and a comment from Mr. Liggett around the reliance on zoning, where some of the PEC standards, for example, are either sort of increased, the thresholds are increased or they're decreased, and the impact that has on the zoning. So I'm interested in the overlapping of the time in terms of right of reply, etc. So
Just so we can talk with Sarah Edwards about that. I think we'd certainly like to have all of us reply in by the time the sweep up 42A report was finalised, which will be sometime in early August.
Look, we're talking just on your point there, the development standards per se really only affect the volume of floor space on a particular property, as I said. The key one where there's the difference is whether there's 3 permitted in the medium density versus the 2 that is currently proposed. I think that's the only sort of difference between the 2 positions where you're actually going to yield potentially more households in a way. So, am I seeing that right?
I think that's right in terms of the actual site itself, so multiple dwellings on a single site.
Yeah.
There obviously is the other issue of subdivision provisions themselves, which relate to fee simple arrangements.
Yeah.
And how the changes proposed in the plan is notified and the 42A report have an impact. I guess how that subdivision land use package goes together as well. That's something that we're certainly thinking about.
I'd just add in terms of the 2 weeks for the right reply, we would need to go talk to a couple of other staff members who do the dwelling demand and supply, and just to get an indication as to how long that bit of work might take. So I can probably come back to you in the next few days and let you know an idea of maybe whether we needed 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
It is a program, but also we need we're near the end of our process.
Yes, yeah, no, we understand that.
So I just want to give this is, these are significant matters in contention. I want to enable the best go within busy lives to do this well, and then also make sure we get to the end with the appropriate interlocking of the reporting.
I'll talk to Ms. Edwards timing of the total package. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have some questions from Mr. Heath, if you're there listening in.
No, he's fallen asleep. No, he didn't.
I hope you heard most of that, Tim. It's always difficult being on the end of the screen in a big meeting.
Yeah, it was.
Yes. That's why I think, yeah, for better or worse, I'll say it, either the all in or the all out sort of works best for these hearings, in terms of face to face. But I know there's some logistics we have to think about. Look, I think Commissioner Littlejohn and McMahon might have some questions for you.
Well, I guess I'm conscious that Kangora want to try and make an airplane.
Yes.
Well, I can, these guys are on the other one, I think, so if I could be excused,
You
that
can
would
be
be.
excused. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Tim, you've you've heard some of the discussion today. Did you listen to anything that we were discussing yesterday with council staff?
I heard nothing yesterday from council, but I've listened as best I can to the discussion today and the questions.
All right, no, that's good. Well, you're in the charmed position that everyone agrees with you. So, and it's very great.
Say
that. So, and you are a critical part of some of the council's reporting. So, I mean, to some extent, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to see whether there's anything you've heard today that you might be able to assist us with in terms of some of the questions we've been grappling with. I mean, we've read your statement of evidence, and I mean, I've got a few notes on it, but I'll just be interested whether the discussion today has prompted you to make some notes that you want to sort of get out there, particularly around determining that ratio of actual houses on land versus how much is zoned, that sort of thing, whether you've got any experience there that you can impart to us.
Yeah. First things first, I'd just like to make one correction to my paragraph 13.6 in my statement of evidence, where on the second to last line, it talks about lower house prices. That should read lower per square meter land prices. So I don't want to send a message that greenfield or urban sprawl will suddenly lead to lower house prices. That's not what my analysis shows. But back to your question. Yeah, I think there is no magic number about a surplus. The key considerations for me from an economic perspective is the extent of oversupply that you'd want to consider, and of course the location of that oversupply. Is that in a location that long-term would be economically efficient to see a densification of residential activity? And so it's a slightly more refined approach than just looking at an oversupply per se. If you wanted to provide an oversupply in the fuzz, I wouldn't be accommodated or wouldn't agree with that, because I think there are more economically efficient locations to provide that supply. I think Kaingaroa's updated position in terms of its the new areas it's identified, or greatly reduced areas that's identified, are starting to head in the right direction in terms of providing that, or seeking densification in and around centres and arterial routes. I think that is long-term economically efficient locations. But in terms of the extent, my analysis shows the council's provision is sufficient for the first 15 to 20 years, and it's not until the long term where some increased medium density is going to be required from council to possibly better manage or restrain some of that development that's likely to be going to the fuzz without an increase in medium density. So I think one of the commissioners, that could have been you, Commissioner Littlejohn, saying that the real difference between Kāinga and council is really the long-term perspective. I would agree with that. And that long-term perspective is the extent of fuzz that's likely to be required under both Kāinga's submission and council's position. So council's position would require more extensive development of the fuzz, whereas Kāinga's position would seek a more efficient and better utilisation of the existing urban framework. So they are the two differences that I see, and I don't see them actually being too far apart, to be honest.
Have you got any advice to us on whether if we recommended the Kāinga position, you might see adverse economic impacts across the CBD at all, or across the urban area? Is that overzoning or oversupply, would there be any negative impacts from an economic perspective?
Short term, there potentially would be. Long term, not so much. So short term, you'd likely to see a dilution of the thrust for densification in and around the CBD in the mixed use zone, at the expense of where Kāinga have identified it. Long term, I think, given my analysis shows that there would be a more medium density zone likely to be required, those costs would dilute out. So long term, I don't think the economic costs would be that significant. In fact, longer term, you could almost run the argument that those costs would be superseded by benefits, because you then get increased intensification in around centres and arterial roads, whereas the counterfactual would be additional development in fuzzland out on the urban fringe of New Plymouth. So it's that push me, pull me type of situation. Short term, I think council's position would cover the requirement. Long term, I think there are more efficient outcomes that could be provided with increased medium density in and around centres and arterials.
I missed when you said what the potential short-term economic impacts might be of the oversupply of zoning. Can you just? I missed what you said. What were that there might be a dilution? Was that the phrase you used?
Correct. Yeah, there'd be a dissipation, I suppose, of impetus for development in and around the CBD to a more broader suburban areas where Kāinga have identified. But that's the short-term issue or cost, but long-term, I think that could be offset.
Mr. Ray, though, has been quite clear to us that even the revised position still identifies medium density in locations that do support a walkable and compact catchment. And so to some extent, the extent of those dilution or dissipation impacts are probably not going to be that extreme, are they?
No, that's fair. No, that's fair. Via the original Kāinga submission, which was more extensive, and would have enabled sort of densification to occur in sort of broader suburbia. I think they've narrowed down their position substantially. I have got some land areas of the differential between the original submission. This is Kāinga's original submission. Just to let you know, also I'm in the process of modelling Koingora's new position. I think there were some questions, I think it was from Commissioner McMahon, I couldn't hear very well, but regarding what Koingora's new position means in terms of feasible capacity. I'm doing that work at the moment, because I think that's a bit of a significant gap at the moment in the consideration. So I'm doing that, but Koingora's original submission encompassed in the order of just over 770 hectares. Their new submission reduces that to about 171 hectares. So it's a significant reduction, and we're running those numbers now. And I think, to be fair to Koingora, the locations that they've chosen for their medium density long term, I think is well positioned around centres and arterials.
Okay.
And I think that goes back to Commissioner Littlejohn, what you were talking about earlier on about what the MPSUD is really trying to instill in councils, and that's what I'd consider good long-term strategic planning that brings in a number of the facets from infrastructure, public transport, rather than working in individual silos. It is an understanding that change is required, and it's how best to manage that in an efficient manner from an economic perspective. And that change isn't necessarily a bad thing. Change is often as a result of growth, and that's a good thing. So it's just understanding that and how to manage that in a more appropriate manner. So I think New Zealand is putting its big boy pants on and starting to think about strategic planning in a more wholesome way, and I think that's a good outcome.
You don't use that phrase anymore.
No. What I hear you're saying, though, is that taking the long-term view is likely to be the more economically efficient pathway.
From a long-term perspective, I think so, yes. For the simple reason, I think the counterfactual would be more extensive use of the fuzz zone land.
Yeah. All right. That's good. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
That's pretty much done for me. Just for completeness, Mr. Heath, because you've raised it, based on what you've heard today, do you still have some residual concerns about keeping the fuzz in the mix in this plan, particularly the smart road one?
The extent of it, yes. I've indicated I've got a level of comfort around a reduced usage of the smart road fuzz long term. Provide a different topology, house price, locational choices, etc. But reliance on it for an extensive use of supply, I don't think is the most economically efficient outcome. There could be other non-economic reasons why it may or may not be appropriate, but from an economic perspective, it wouldn't result in the most efficient outcome for council long term.
Just for me to get an understanding of the significance of your concern with it. You understand that it's a holding zone and that it can't be enacted until there's a plan change or a variation under the first schedule. You understand that?
Yeah.
So that involves council assessment and a public process and a merits assessment at the time.
Correct.
It certainly wouldn't occur in the next 2 to 3 years. The council wouldn't entertain a private plan change in the first 2-year period, presumably.
No, I wouldn't think so, but in my experience in Auckland, it doesn't stop developers trying.
No, but there's grounds for the council not to accept that on that basis. You accept that, and then you accept that at the strategic objective level, it's seen as a long-term solution only in terms of UFD 14. the fuzz doesn't make an appearance at the strategic objective level in the short to medium term. You understand that?
Sorry, it was just a bit difficult to hear you, Commissioner.
Okay, sorry. UFD 14 is in two tranches.
Yes.
The short and medium term tranche identifies infill, intensification and greenfield development areas as supplying their necessary capacity. And the second tranche focuses on future urban zones in the long term. Yeah. So
Right.
except from a timing point of view, the objective is very clear in terms of what the stated outcome would be.
Yes, I think so. I think that assists.
So to decide the question of appropriateness, we've been advised that there are a proposed policy P7 and P8 looking at a policy framework for dealing with the timing and merit assessment of any future urban zone plan changes. Are you familiar with those policies?
Oh yeah, I went to them earlier on today,
Yes.
but I wouldn't say I'm super familiar.
No, but if we were to put to you that they provide some ability for the council to control the timing and filter out capacity issues, would that provide you with some comfort with the retention of the fuzz as a long-term planning technique to meet that second tranche of objective UFD 14?
If there's considered to be teeth in that policy that would enable council to push that back, then I've got a level of comfort around that. And at the same time, council still has the ability to promote additional medium density zone at any point in the future as well, to help accommodate future growth. So that could be an offsetting characteristic.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Sorry about the difficulty in hearing me. I'm not shouting.
Yeah. Just on that last point, the P7 and P8 having teeth, I'm just interested in what sort of information would council need to gather in order to be able to justify a position that the developer who turns up and says, I want to take 200 hectares off this smart road zone and turn it into urban now. What information would council need to have to be able to say, well, we're sorry, you simply don't comply with the policy because our rate of infill development hasn't reached this, or our structure plan development areas haven't yet been developed. I mean, is there some basic information that would help council support itself to rely on that policy?
Yeah, I think the actual monitoring program of the capacity is really important. Is really important in this process. And by way of an example, we're doing the update to the capacity in Wellington for part of the NPS qualifying matter assessment. And we did that last September once they released their new quotable value valuations. We updated it this year with a 10% drop in price and a 10% increase in construction costs. That affected the feasible capacity by 40%, reduced it by 40%. So small fluctuations in price and construction costs can have a material impact on the level of feasibility in a district. So really getting updated metrics like that at the time is really important.
Yes. Okay, well, that's been really helpful. Thanks.
Just finally, Mr. Heath, will you be updating your statement of evidence to reflect the Koyangara position?
Just going to contribute to the tables, wasn't it?
If that's your instruction, I'm happy to. I could provide an addendum potentially with the additional analysis on what the Koyangara position in terms of feasible capacity means.
Yeah. Tim, I think you'll have an opportunity to feed into the council's right to reply. So
Oh, great.
after hearing, as as part of the expert 42A report. So that's probably the most procedurally correct way of you perhaps coming back
okay.
into with some further advice. So if you
Okay,
certainly feed into the agreed statement of fact, but also work with Campbell and Louise on the final reply in terms of where you end up as advice to us from the council team.
great. Okay,
Yeah.
happy with that.
Yeah, David.
I'm just a little bit confused about how your modelling exercise that you're currently running relates to the updated tables in terms of the statements of fact that we've asked Mr. Robinson and Mr. Campbell to contribute to.
So what I'm doing in my exercise is I'm having to create a new GIS layer for the extent of the medium density zone that Kaingoa are now promoting, and then running that through the feasibility model to look at the capacity side of it.
Is that something you'll pick up in your tables?
Okay, that's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, and Tim, look, I don't have any further questions, but an observation really that, you're the classic expert that is really looking at this from your own expertise without, fear or favour of giving us your opinion, just because you're working for the council. So it's decision makers, we really appreciate the quality of your evidence and your advice to us, just on that basis. Thank you very much.
No problem, much appreciated. Good to see you all.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, I think we might be done for the day, and the planes to catch and everything else. I'll just end today with a huge thank you to everyone. It's been a pretty important day, and certainly this is a big topic for us to decide. Bit more work to do, but thank everyone again for all the hard work you're doing on this, because probably a pretty pivotal stage in the future of New Plymouth District and the city environment particularly. So thank you and just appreciate everyone else coming and hearing from Kaingoa. May see you again around the traps, but small world out there. Thank you very much, everyone.